good evening, or perhaps good morning, depending on when the darkness finds you. I am Eli Nightfall, and it's a distinct pleasure to have your company once more as we draw back the curtain on another corner of the shadowed world that lies just beneath the veneer of our everyday lives. Tonight, we venture into a place where art meets aberration, where passion becomes a pathway to peril, and where an object of beauty can hold within its intricate mechanics a malevolence as old as time itself. Our story is called The Specter in the Camera. Settle in. Let the sounds of the world outside fade. There is only my voice, and the story that waits to unfold. Arthur Finch considered himself a connoisseur of moments, a hunter of the ephemeral. Photography, to him, was not merely a profession or a hobby. It was a sacred act, a method of plucking instances from the relentless flow of time and rendering them immortal, or at least as immortal as silver halide and paper could allow. He sought character in the lines of a face, history in the texture of stone, untold narratives in the way light caressed an object. His cramped apartment, smelling faintly of developer and stop bath, was a testament to this obsession, its walls adorned with images that spoke of a patient eye and a deep empathy for the world he framed. But empathy, Arthur was about to learn, could be a fragile shield against forces that cared little for human sentiment. It was on a drear Tuesday, the kind where the city sky wept a relentless, unenthusiastic drizzle, that Arthur found it. He often haunted the city's forgotten alcoves, pawn shops that glittered with lost dreams, antique stores overflowing with the detritus of bygone eras, flea markets where history was sold by the pound. He was searching for props, for inspiration, for anything that might whisper a new story to his lens. The shop was called Curios and Relics, a name that barely did justice to the chaotic accretion of objects crammed within its dusty confines. It was less a store and more a crypt for discarded memories, presided over by a proprietor who seemed as ancient and cobwebbed as his wares. And there, nestled amongst tarnished silver lockets, chipped porcelain dolls with vacant stares, and a collection of discolored medical instruments that hinted at grim histories, Arthur saw it. It sat on a faded, wine-colored velvet cloth, not showcased, but almost hidden, as if it possessed a shy malevolence. The camera. It was a large-format bellows camera, a magnificent anachronism from perhaps the late 19th or early 20th century. Its wooden body, likely mahogany or a dark cherry, glowed with a deep, rich patina that decades of handling had imparted. The brass fittings, the lens housing, the focusing knobs, the intricate clasps were tarnished to a warm, coppery bronze, not with neglect, but with the dignity of age. The leather of the bellows, though showing fine cracks like the map of an unknown land, was remarkably intact. Arthur felt an immediate, visceral pull, a strange resonance that hummed in his bones. It wasn't just its antique beauty or the evident craftsmanship. There was something more, an almost imperceptible thrum of energy, a cold spot in the otherwise stuffy air of the shop that seemed to emanate from it. He reached out, his fingers tracing the cool wood. The proprietor, a wraith-like man with eyes like clouded agates, materialized from the gloom. "Ah," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "She speaks to you, does she?" Arthur, usually a man of careful words, found himself simply nodding, his gaze still fixed on the camera. "It's remarkable," he managed. "Remarkable, yes," the old man echoed, a strange, knowing half-smile playing on his lips. "Seen a lot, this one. Captured a lot. More than light, I reckon." He tapped a bony finger against the lens, which, despite the dust on the camera body, was surprisingly clear, like a dark, unblinking eye. "They don't make them like this anymore. They don't dare." The price was surprisingly low, almost suspiciously so, as if the old man were eager to be rid of it. Arthur, however, was too captivated by the camera's allure to question his good fortune. He imagined the portraits he could take, the depth, the character that modern digital sensors often failed to convey. This camera promised a connection to the very soul of photography, to its alchemic origins. He paid the sum, and the old man wrapped the heavy instrument in a piece of oilcloth, his movements slow and ritualistic. "Treat her well," he whispered, his breath smelling of dust and something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling. "She demands attention." Back in his apartment, the rain still drumming a somber tattoo against his window panes, Arthur unwrapped his prize. He spent hours with it, cleaning the wood, gently polishing the brass, examining every intricate detail. The shutter mechanism, a complex pneumatic affair, still worked with a satisfying, albeit slightly wheezing click. The ground glass focusing screen was dim but usable. It came with a dozen glass plate holders, heavy and solid. There was no maker's mark he could discern, no serial number, which was unusual for an instrument of this quality. It was as if it had willed itself into existence, anonymous and singular. He felt an inexplicable urgency to use it, a craving that went beyond his usual professional enthusiasm. It was almost a hunger. The next morning, the city was washed clean, the sun a pale disk in a recovering sky. His friend, Eliza Bloom, a struggling painter with a cascade of fiery red hair and a perpetually amused glint in her eyes, had agreed to sit for him. She often modeled for him, her expressive face a perfect canvas for his experiments in light and shadow. "So this is the ancient relic?" she teased, eyeing the imposing camera on its heavy wooden tripod. "Looks like it could swallow you whole, Artie." Arthur just smiled, his attention already consumed by the process. He positioned Eliza near the window, the soft morning light sculpting her features. Composing the shot through the dim ground glass was a slow, deliberate process, an intimate dance between photographer and subject. He draped the dark cloth over his head, shutting out the world, entering the camera's private domain. The image of Eliza, inverted and ethereal, shimmered before him. He adjusted the focus, the bellows sighing softly. There was a stillness, a profundity to this method that digital photography, for all its convenience, lacked. "Hold that," he murmured, his voice muffled by the cloth. Eliza's expression was thoughtful, a slight, almost melancholic smile playing on her lips, her gaze directed somewhere beyond the confines of the room. It was perfect. He inserted a plate holder, drew the dark slide, and with a quiet intensity, squeezed the shutter release bulb. The camera let out its characteristic soft thwomp hiss, a sound that seemed to momentarily suck the air from the room. Later, in the amber glow of his darkroom, as Eliza's image slowly materialized in the developing tray, Arthur felt a thrill that was sharper, more potent than usual. The photograph was extraordinary. The clarity was breathtaking. Every freckle on Eliza's skin, every stray strand of her vibrant hair rendered with an almost supernatural precision. But it wasn't just the sharpness. There was an intensity to her gaze, a depth in her eyes that he hadn't consciously seen while taking the shot. And the smile, it was still there, but now, in the fixed image, it seemed less melancholic and more resigned, almost like a farewell. Around her, the light seemed to cling, but the shadows in the periphery of the frame were deeper, more absolute than he remembered. A shiver, cold and unbidden, traced its way down Arthur's spine. He dismissed it as the lingering chill of the unheated darkroom, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by his excitement over the new camera. It was, after all, the most stunning portrait he had ever taken. He couldn't wait to show Eliza. He couldn't wait to use the camera again. He had no idea, then, that the camera had already shown him more than he could possibly comprehend. He didn't realize that the shutter's click was not just capturing a moment, but sealing it with an awful, irrevocable finality. The Specter in the camera had taken its first look, and its work had just begun. Chapter 1. The Perfect Shot. The camera dominated the small workbench in Arthur Finch's apartment, a brooding monolith of polished dark wood and tarnished brass. It had been 3 days since he'd brought it home from curios and relics. 3 days in which its presence had subtly altered the familiar landscape of his living space, drawing his eye constantly. A silent, stoic observer. It wasn't merely an object. It felt like an entity, ancient and patient, its single, large lens a cyclopean eye regarding him with a veiled intelligence. Arthur, a man whose life was a testament to the visual, found himself increasingly captivated not by what the camera overtly showed, but by what it seemed to conceal within its shadowy bulk. He'd spent hours simply running his hands over its surfaces, the cool, smooth wood worn by countless anonymous hands, the intricate brass fittings cold to the touch. Each click and whir of its mechanisms a whisper from a bygone era. He'd cleaned it meticulously, a ritual of familiarization, yet the faint, distinctive odor he'd first noticed in the shop, a coppery, almost ozonic scent, like the air after a lightning strike too close, clung to it, a persistent, unsettling perfume. He found no maker's mark, no serial number, an anonymity that only deepened its mystique. It was as if it had sprung fully formed from the mind of some forgotten, perhaps mad, artisan, a singular creation for a singular, unknown purpose. His initial excitement was less about a new tool and more akin to the trepidation an archaeologist might feel before an unopened sarcophagus. There was a profound sense of potential within it, but also a frisson of the forbidden. Arthur Finch was not a superstitious man by nature. His world was one of light and shadow, of chemical reactions and precise optics. He believed in what he could see, what he could capture, what he could develop with his own hands in the alchemical sanctuary of his darkroom. Yet, this camera unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate, a low thrum beneath the surface of his rational mind. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a profound, almost reverent unease. He'd tried to research it, poring over antique photography forums, library archives, and obscure dealer catalogs, but found nothing matching its specific configuration, its unmarked solemnity. It was a ghost in the machine of history. He'd even attempted a few preliminary shots, simple still lives, a bowl of fruit, a stack of well-worn books. The chipped porcelain figure of a dancer he kept on his windowsill. The process was laborious, a stark contrast to the instantaneity of his digital workhorse. Each exposure required careful composition on the dim ground glass, the insertion of a heavy glass plate holder, the almost ceremonial drawing of the dark slide, and then the soft, deliberate squeeze of the pneumatic shutter bulb. The sound it made, a gentle thwump hiss, was unlike any shutter he knew, less a mechanical action and more like a soft, indrawn breath. The results, when he developed the plates, were astonishing. The clarity was preternatural, a sharpness that seemed to cut through the veil of ordinary perception. The fruit in the bowl wasn't merely depicted. It was rendered with such tactile reality that he felt he could pluck it from the glossy surface of the print, its skin glistening with an almost impossible dewiness. The books seemed to exude the very scent of old paper and ink, their titles on the spines not just legible but almost embossed. But beyond the technical perfection, there was something else, a quality he struggled to define, a certain weight, a stillness that was more than just the absence of motion. It was as if the camera hadn't just recorded the objects, but had somehow distilled their essence, their very being, into the silver emulsion. He decided it was time to photograph a person. Still lives were one thing, the human face, with its shifting landscape of emotion and thought, was another entirely. It was the ultimate test for any lens, any photographer. His friend, Eliza Bloom, was the obvious choice. She was patient, accustomed to his artistic eccentricities, and possessed a face that was a cartographer's dream of expression. When she arrived, her fiery red hair a vibrant splash of color in his muted apartment. She regarded the hulking camera with her usual blend of amusement and curiosity. Still wrestling with the antique beast, Artie, she'd asked, her green eyes sparkling. "Does it bite?" He'd merely smiled, the familiar pre-shoot tension, now amplified by the camera's peculiar aura, settling over him. He arranged her by the north-facing window, the diffused morning light a sculptor's tool, carving her features from the shadows. As he draped the dark cloth over his head, The world outside vanished, replaced by the inverted, ethereal image of Eliza on the ground glass. It was like stepping into another realm, a silent, monochromatic world where only he and his subject existed. The scent of the camera, that strange, ozonic tang, seemed stronger under the cloth, almost intimate. He focused carefully, the image swimming into sharp relief. Eliza held her pose, a thoughtful, slightly wistful expression on her face. Her gaze distant. It was a look he'd captured before, but through this lens, it seemed imbued with a new poignancy, a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within him. He felt a sudden, inexplicable reluctance to press the shutter, a fleeting sense of trespass. But the artist in him, the hunter of moments, pushed past the unease. He inserted the plate holder, the click of its engagement unervingly loud in the focused silence. "Hold that," he murmured, his voice sounding distant even to his own ears. He drew the dark slide, the scrape of metal on what a final, irrevocable commitment. Then he squeezed the bulb. Thwomp hiss. The soft sigh of the camera seemed to linger in the air, and for a moment, Arthur felt a peculiar lightness in his own chest, as if he too had exhaled something vital. Eliza blinked, the spell broken. "Well," she asked, stretching, "did it steal my soul?" Arthur forced a laugh. Just a sliver of it, perhaps. The usual photographic larceny. But as he removed the plate holder, its weight felt more significant than usual, imbued with more than just glass and emulsion. The darkroom, his sanctuary, was bathed in the hellish, yet comforting, red glow of the safe light. The familiar chemical odors, usually a source of reassurance, now mingled with that persistent, indefinable scent from the camera, creating a disquieting olfactory blend. He slid the glass plate into the developer tray, his fingers slightly trembling, an uncharacteristic reaction. He rocked the tray gently, watching, waiting. The image began to emerge, a ghostly apparition at first, then slowly resolving into denser forms. Eliza's face swam up from the creamy liquid, her eyes seeming to fix on his from the depths of the developing solution. And then he saw it, the sheer, impossible clarity. It surpassed even the still lives. Every pore, every fine laugh line around her eyes, the delicate tracery of veins beneath the translucent skin of her temple. All were rendered with a fidelity that was both breathtaking and profoundly unsettling. It was as if you were looking not at a photograph, but through a window directly into her being. Her red hair, even in monochrome, seemed to possess an almost fiery luminescence. But it was her expression that held him captive. The wistfulness he'd seen was there, yes, but magnified, deepened into a profound, almost heartbreaking melancholy. Her smile, which had seemed gentle and introspective through the viewfinder, now looked like a fragile mask, a brave front against some unseen sorrow. And her eyes, they were focused on something far beyond the confines of his small apartment, something that seemed to fill them with a deep, knowing sadness, a resignation that was almost unbearable to witness. He'd photographed Eliza countless times, knew her moods, her expressions, as well as he knew his own. This was different. This was too much, too real, too raw. It was as if the camera had bypassed the surface and photographed not her likeness, but the very landscape of her soul, and found there a quiet tragedy he had never suspected. He pulled the plate, his heart hammering, and moved it through the stop bath, then into the fixer. As the image stabilized, becoming permanent, the feeling of unease intensified. He made a print, watching with a kind of horrified fascination as Eliza's sorrowful face emerged on the paper. He pinned it up to dry, the droplets of water clinging to its surface like tears. He told himself it was the power of the antique lens, its unique rendering capabilities, the way old optics could sometimes produce an unexpected emotional depth. He told himself he was projecting his own recent anxieties onto the image. But a cold knot of dread was tightening in his stomach. He looked at the other prints he'd made with the camera. The still lives. The fruit, so vibrant, now seemed almost too perfect, its dewiness like a fever sweat. The books, their titles so clear, seemed to whisper a forgotten, perhaps forbidden, knowledge. The porcelain dancer, frozen in her eternal pirouette, now looked less graceful and more like a captive, her painted smile a rictus of silent suffering. Had these qualities been there before? Or was he only seeing them now? His perception tainted by the overwhelming emotional impact of Eliza's portrait? He remembered the antique dealer's words. Seen a lot. This one. Captured a lot. More than light, I reckon. And then, chillingly, they don't make them like this anymore. They don't dare. What had he meant? What terrible knowledge lay behind that cryptic warning? Arthur felt a sudden, desperate need for fresh air, a need to escape the claustrophobic intimacy of the darkroom, to wash the chemical scents and the camera's strange aura from his skin. He stepped out into his living area, but the camera sat on its workbench, its lens like a dark, accusing eye, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was only the beginning. The perfect shot had been achieved, but at what potential cost he was only beginning to dread. The excitement he'd felt over its unique capabilities was rapidly souring into something far more sinister. A creeping apprehension that this camera didn't just take pictures, it took something else. Something irreplaceable. The print of Eliza, stark and luminous under the single bulb of his desk lamp, seemed to watch him. Arthur found himself unable to look away for long, drawn back to the profound sorrow in her eyes, the unsettling resignation etched into her features. He tried to call her, to hear her voice, to reassure himself that the woman in the photograph was merely an artifact of light and chemistry, not a true reflection of her current state. But his calls went straight to voicemail, her usual cheerful greeting now sounding almost like a ghostly echo. He told himself she was busy, probably lost in her painting, headphones on, oblivious to the outside world. It was typical Eliza. Yet, the silence on the other end of the line felt heavier than usual, freighted with an unaccustomed anxiety. He paced his small apartment, the camera on the workbench a constant, silent rebuke. He considered packing it away, hiding it in a closet, but the thought felt strangely futile, like trying to hide from his own shadow. Its presence was too potent, too demanding. He kept glancing at the photograph, comparing it to other portraits he'd taken of her over the years. Those were good, some even excellent, capturing her vibrancy, her humor, her quick intelligence. But none of them possessed this unnerving depth, this almost unbearable intimacy. This new portrait felt less like a depiction and more like a vivisection of her spirit. He found himself obsessively replaying the moments of the photo shoot. Had there been something in her demeanor he'd missed? A fleeting sadness, a flicker of worry? She'd seemed her usual self, perhaps a little more pensive than usual, but nothing to foreshadow the profound melancholy that stared back at him from the print. No, this was the camera. It had to be. It hadn't just captured her image. It had dredged something from her soul, something she perhaps wasn't even consciously aware of. Or a more disturbing thought began to coalesce in his mind. Had the camera imprinted this sorrow onto her? Had the act of being photographed by this strange, ancient device somehow altered her? He shook his head, trying to dispel the notion. That was madness. Cameras recorded, they didn't influence. They were passive observers, not active participants in reality. Weren't they? Yet, the weight of the camera in his hands, the almost animate quality of its lens, the cryptic words of the antique dealer, she demands attention, all conspired to whisper a different, more sinister narrative. The day wore on, each tick of his cheap kitchen clock amplifying the silence, stretching his nerves taut. He tried to work on other projects, editing digital files from a recent commercial shoot, but his focus was shattered. Eliza's face, her eyes, kept superimposing themselves over the mundane images on his screen. He ate without tasting, drank coffee that failed to clear the fog of unease in his head. By late afternoon, with still no word from Eliza, a genuine fear began to take root. This wasn't just artistic angst anymore. It was a growing premonition, cold and sharp. He decided he had to see her, to break this spell of silence and assuage the dread that was coiling in his gut. Her studio apartment was across town, a bright, chaotic space usually filled with the scent of turpentine and the vibrant chaos of her work. He grabbed his keys, his jacket, and hesitated at the door. His gaze fell on the photograph of Eliza, pinned to his bulletin board. He felt an almost physical compulsion to take it with him, though he couldn't explain why. He unpinned it carefully, slid it into a protective sleeve, and tucked it into his jacket pocket, the stiff paper a strange comfort against his chest. The journey across town was a blur of traffic and gray cityscapes. Arthur's mind raced, rehearsing what he would say, trying to frame his concerns without sounding like he'd lost his mind. "Eliza, my new camera seems to have photographed your secret despair. Are you okay?" "No, that wouldn't do." He arrived at her building, an old brick walk-up with a slightly crooked stoop, and a knot of apprehension tightened in his chest. The familiar, brightly painted front door seemed less welcoming than usual. He buzzed her apartment twice. No answer. This was unusual, even when engrossed in her work. She usually responded to a persistent buzz. He tried calling her cell again, straight to voicemail. Now the fear was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was a cold wave washing over him. He remembered that Eliza often left a spare key hidden under a loose brick by the potted geraniums on the landing. His heart pounded as he found it, the cold metal a small, desperate hope in his palm. He let himself into her apartment, calling her name. "Eliza? It's Arthur. Are you here?" Silence. A thick, unnatural silence that was utterly alien to this usually vibrant space. Her studio was just as he remembered it. Canvases leaning against every wall, some finished, some gloriously incomplete, jars crammed with brushes, palettes smeared with a rainbow of dried paint. The air still held the familiar scent of her work, but it was overlaid with something else now, a faint, cloying sweetness that made his stomach clench. And it was cold, unnaturally cold, despite the radiators hissing faintly in the corner. A half-finished canvas stood on her main easel, a bold abstract swirl of blues and greens, but her usual stool was empty, a brush lying discarded on the floor beside it, as if dropped in haste. His eyes scanned the room, his dread mounting with every passing second. Then he saw it. On the small, paint-splattered table where she kept her sketches and notebooks lay a single, framed photograph. His photograph, the one he had taken with the cursed camera. It was propped up, facing the easel, as if she had been studying it. But it wasn't just the photograph. Arranged around its base, in a disturbingly deliberate pattern, were several small, withered flowers, their petals a dull, lifeless brown, the source of the sweet, cloying scent. Arthur felt his blood run cold. This was wrong, terribly wrong. "Eliza," he called again, his voice hoarse, louder this time, laced with a desperate urgency. He moved further into the apartment, past the kitchen alcove, towards her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, his hand trembling. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, but there was enough light filtering through for him to see the shape on the bed. Eliza. She was lying on her back, her fiery red hair splayed out on the pillow like a tragic halo. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Her skin was pale, impossibly pale, and her lips, those lips that had smiled that melancholic, resigned smile in his photograph, were tinged with blue. And her expression, it was the exact same expression as in the photograph. The same profound, heartbreaking sorrow, the same unbearable resignation, frozen now into the permanence of death. It was as if she had looked at his portrait and then simply willed herself into its likeness, or rather, into its terrible, prophetic truth. Arthur stumbled back, a choked cry escaping his lips. His legs felt weak, his vision blurring. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling for the print he had brought with him. He held it up, his hand shaking violently, comparing it to the still, silent figure on the bed. They were identical. The pose, the expression, the very angle of her head. The photograph hadn't just captured a fleeting moment of sadness. It had been a death mask, a meticulously rendered blueprint for her demise. The camera hadn't just seen her sorrow. It had ordained it. It had killed her. The perfect shot had become a perfect execution. The premonition he'd felt, the subtle, unsettling details in the image, they weren't artistic interpretation. They were the cold, hard facts of a future that was now her present, her end. He was no longer just a photographer. He was a harbinger, an unwitting accomplice to a death foretold in silver and shadow. Chapter 2. A Still Life's End. The Wail of Sirens, a sound Arthur usually associated with distant, impersonal tragedies, now screamed directly at him. Each rise and fall a fresh stab of guilt and horror. He stood numbly in Eliza's paint-splattered studio, the flashing blue and red lights painting grotesque, dancing shadows on the vibrant canvases that were her life's work. The paramedics had come and gone, their movements efficient, their expressions somber but professional. They'd pronounced her dead at the scene, their hushed tones doing little to dispel the monstrous reality that had taken root in Arthur's soul. Then the police had arrived. Their questions a barrage he could barely process, his answers hollow, inadequate. How could he explain the photograph? How could he articulate the sickening certainty that his camera, his art, had somehow orchestrated this? He'd mumbled something about finding her, about being a concerned friend. He hadn't mentioned the camera, the print in his pocket, the chilling, perfect correspondence between image and lifeless form. They would think him mad. He felt mad. The world had tilted on its axis, its familiar laws of cause and effect shattered by the impossible truth that lay still in the next room. He was eventually allowed to leave. After giving a statement that felt like a flimsy fabrication, a pathetic attempt to mask an unspeakable horror with mundane details. He walked out of Eliza's building into the cold, indifferent city air, the print of her death portrait feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. He didn't go home. He couldn't face the camera, couldn't bear to be in the same room with the instrument that had, he was now utterly convinced, stolen his friend's life. He walked for hours aimlessly, through streets that seemed alien and hostile, his mind a maelstrom of grief, disbelief, and a burgeoning, terrifying understanding. Every storefront window, reflecting his haggard face, seemed to accuse him. Every click of a pedestrian's camera phone sent a jolt of fear through him. The act of photography, once his passion, his solace, now felt tainted, imbued with a predatory malevolence. He thought of the antique dealer's words. More than light, I reckon. What else did it capture? Life force? Destiny? Was it a vessel for some ancient, soul-consuming entity? The thoughts, once easily dismissed as fanciful paranoia, now clawed at him with the sharp talons of undeniable truth. Exhaustion finally drove him back to his apartment in the gray, pre-dawn hours. The city was quiet, resting before its daily resurrection. But for Arthur, there would be no rest. As he unlocked his door, the sight of the camera, sitting placidly on its workbench, hit him like a physical blow. Its polished wood and brass gleamed faintly in the dim light filtering through his window, its lens a dark, knowing eye. It looked expectant, sated perhaps. He felt a surge of revulsion so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He wanted to smash it, to hurl it against the wall until it was nothing but splinters and shards. But a deeper, colder fear stayed his hand. What if destroying it unleashed something worse? What if it was merely a conduit, and its destruction would do nothing to stop the force behind it? Or, more pragmatically, what if the police, in their inevitable follow-up, asked about his photographic equipment, about the last photos he'd taken of Eliza? He couldn't afford to appear to be destroying evidence, even if the evidence pointed to something beyond their comprehension. He needed to test it again. The thought was horrifying, a betrayal of Eliza's memory. Yet it was also an undeniable compulsion. He had to be sure. He had to understand the parameters of this curse. Was it specific to people? Could it be a one-time, ghastly coincidence? A tragic fluke amplified by his own overwrought imagination and the camera's unsettling aesthetics? A tiny, desperate part of him clung to that possibility, even as the larger, saner part knew it was a lie. He couldn't bring himself to point it at another human being, not after Eliza. The very idea was abhorrent. So, he chose something impersonal. It's something that held a small, quiet significance for him. A delicate Boston fern he'd nurtured for years, a vibrant splash of green in his otherwise monochromatic existence. It sat on his windowsill, its feathery fronds usually a small comfort, a reminder of life's gentle persistence. Now it was to be a sacrifice, a canary in a coal mine of terrifying proportions. His hands trembled as he set up the hulking camera, its familiar weight now feeling leaden with dread. The ritual of preparing the shot, composing on the ground glass, inserting the plate holder, drawing the dark slide, was no longer a meditative process, but a sequence of reluctant, fearful actions. The fern, in the dim light of the ground glass, looked fragile, vulnerable. He focused, trying to detach himself, to view it merely as a subject, an arrangement of shapes and tones. But he saw Eliza's face, her lifeless eyes. He nearly stopped, nearly abandoned the terrible experiment. But the need to know, to confirm the awful truth, or by some miracle, to dispel it, was too strong. He squeezed the shutter bulb. Flump hiss. The camera's soft sigh seemed to draw the very life from the room. He developed the plate with a sickening sense of inevitability. As the image of the fern emerged in the developer, it was like Eliza's portrait, preternaturally sharp, each delicate leaflet rendered with painful clarity. But there was something wrong. In the photograph, one of the largest, healthiest fronds was inexplicably drooped, its tip browned and withered, as if blighted. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the frond had been perfectly healthy just moments before he'd taken a shot. He'd watered it that morning. He'd admired its vibrancy. The photograph showed a decay that hadn't existed. He left the plate to fix, unable to watch it become permanent. He went to the window, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He looked at the fern, and there it was, the same large frond. The one so vibrant just an hour ago was now visibly drooping, its tip turning a sickly, necrotic brown. It was exactly as depicted in the photograph. The blight was subtle, not something a casual observer might notice immediately. But to Arthur, who knew the plant intimately, it was a glaring, horrifying confirmation. The camera hadn't just predicted a future state. It had caused it. It was a conduit of decay, a purveyor of doom, its lens a window through which some blighting force reached out to touch and wither the world. The relief he might have felt that it wasn't exclusively a killer of humans was instantly overshadowed by the broader, more insidious implication. It was a killer of life. Anything he photographed, anything he focused its malevolent eye upon, was condemned. The full weight of his discovery pressed down on him, suffocating him. He was the custodian of a weapon, a cursed artifact that dealt in death and decay, disguised as an instrument of art. Every principle he'd held dear, every belief about the sanctity of his craft, had been violated, turned into a grotesque mockery. He thought of the countless photographs he'd taken over the years, the moments of joy, sorrow, beauty, and life he had preserved. Now, that act of preservation felt like a lie. This camera, this Specter in his possession, had shown him the dark underside of image-making, where capturing a likeness was akin to signing a death warrant. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence irrefutable. First Eliza, her vibrant life extinguished, her death a perfect echo of the camera's vision. Now his fern, its quiet vitality sapped, its decay mirroring the blight foretold in the emulsion. The connection was absolute, terrifyingly precise. He was trapped, bound to this horrifying object by a secret too monstrous to share, too dangerous to ignore. He didn't know what to do, where to turn. He only knew that the camera sat in his apartment, silent, patient, and undoubtedly hungry, waiting for its next subject, its next victim. And he, Arthur Finch, photographer, was its unwilling, terrified accomplice. The second subject had perished, its end precisely as depicted. and Arthur's last vestiges of denial crumbled into dust, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of the camera's malevolent power. The apartment felt like a tomb, the camera its unholy relic. Arthur moved through the rooms like a ghost, his own reflection in the dusty window panes a stranger's face, gaunt and haunted. Sleep offered no escape, only a series of disjointed, nightmarish images. Eliza's sightless eyes, the wilting fern, the camera's lens expanding to swallow him whole. He'd covered the camera with a black cloth, a futile gesture, as if shielding his eyes from a basilisk. But he could still feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight in the atmosphere of the room, a silent, knowing thrum that vibrated in his bones. He avoided looking at the prints, Eliza's, the ferns, yet they were seared into his mind, each horrifying detail a testament to the camera's deadly precision. The coincidence he had so desperately hoped for after Eliza's death was now a cruel joke. This was a pattern, a horrifyingly consistent mechanism of doom. The second subject, his innocent fern, had withered exactly as foretold, its small, silent demise a chilling echo of Eliza's much larger tragedy. The camera didn't discriminate between human and plant, between complex consciousness and simple life. It only consumed, it only ordained endings. Days bled into a sleepless, paranoia-fueled week. He unplugged his phone, unable to bear the thought of calls from concerned friends of Eliza, or worse, further inquiries from the police. The official cause of Eliza's death had been ruled an aneurysm, a sudden, tragic, but ultimately natural event. Arthur knew better. He knew the aneurysm had been summoned, willed into existence by the malevolent intelligence residing within the brass and mahogany of his cursed acquisition. He was the sole keeper of this terrible secret, a burden that pressed down on him, isolating him from the rest of humanity. Who would believe him? He imagined their pitying smiles, their concerned suggestions of grief-induced delusion. He would be dismissed as a madman, his story a fantastical concoction born of sorrow and stress. Yet the evidence was irrefutable, displayed in the stark, undeniable transformation of his fern. In the ghostly superimposition of Eliza's photographed end onto her actual one, he found himself drawn to the camera, despite his terror. He'd lift a corner of the black cloth, peering at its inert form, trying to understand, to find some clue, some hint of its origins or its purpose. Was it possessed? Was it a demonic artifact? Or was it something else entirely? Something beyond the familiar lexicon of horror, a product of some forgotten, esoteric science? The antique dealer's face, wreathed in shadows and cryptic smiles, haunted his waking thoughts. She demands attention. Had he been a previous victim, or merely a knowing purveyor of the curse, eager to pass it on? The questions gnawed at him, offering no solace, only deepening the abyss of his fear. He knew he should get rid of it, hurl it into the deepest part of the river, smash it to pieces with a sledgehammer. But the fear that had stayed his hand before was still potent, amplified now by the confirmation of its power. What if destroying it was impossible? What if it could somehow retaliate? The camera had already demonstrated an ability to influence reality. Who was to say its power was limited to its subjects? It was Mark who finally broke through Arthur's self-imposed isolation. Mark Thorne was a fellow photographer, a brash, cynical, relentlessly pragmatic man who had always viewed Arthur's more artistic leanings with a kind of amused skepticism. He was the last person Arthur wanted to see, the last person he could imagine confiding in. But Mark was persistent. He'd apparently been calling, leaving increasingly impatient messages, and finally, he just showed up, hammering on Arthur's door until Arthur, looking like a wraith, had reluctantly let him in. Mark's usual boisterous demeanor faltered when he saw Arthur's state. The disarray of his apartment, the haunted look in his eyes. "God, Artie, you look like hell," he'd said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I heard about Eliza. I'm so sorry, man. That's awful." Arthur had just nodded, unable to form words. Mark, never one for comfortable silences, pressed on. "People are worried about you. You've dropped off the map. What's going on? Arthur didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the desperation, the crushing weight of his secret, the sheer human need to voice the unvoiceable, even to someone who would surely scoff. Or maybe it was a reckless, subconscious desire to be proven wrong, to have Mark's unyielding pragmatism shatter his terrifying certainty. He started talking, hesitantly at first, then with a rush of frantic words, the story tumbling out, the camera, Eliza's portrait, her death, the fern. He knew he sounded unhinged, his voice cracking, his gestures wild. He expected Mark to interrupt, to laugh, to tell him he was losing it. But Mark listened, his expression shifting from concern to a kind of wary curiosity, his usual cynicism tempered by the raw, undeniable distress radiating from Arthur. When Arthur finally fell silent, exhausted and trembling, Mark didn't immediately dismiss him. He looked around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the shrouded camera on the workbench. "This camera," he said slowly, "the one you got from the junk shop?" Arthur nodded. "And you really think it's killing things?" "I don't think, Mark. I know." Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. "I saw it. Twice." He gestured towards the wilting fern on the windowsill, then pulled out the print of Eliza, his hand shaking so much he could barely hold it steady. Mark looked at the photograph, his brow furrowed. It was undeniably a stunning portrait, imbued with that unsettling emotional depth Arthur had described. He then looked at the fern. "Okay," Mark said, still skeptical, but with a new flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Okay, let's say, for the sake of argument, I entertain this insane idea. You're saying if you photograph something with this thing, it dies or decays exactly like in the picture?" Arthur nodded miserably. "So what are you going to do? Become a botanical hitman? Start taking pictures of weeds?" Mark's attempt at levity fell flat, a hollow sound in the oppressive atmosphere. Then a challenging glint entered his eyes. "You know what? I don't believe you. Not really. Grief does strange things to people, Artie. But there's one way to prove it, isn't there?" Arthur felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" Mark grinned, a reckless, almost predatory expression. "Photograph me." Arthur recoiled as if struck. "No, Mark, absolutely not. You don't understand. It's not a game. It's real." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly," Mark said, his voice laced with a dare. "You're scared, and maybe you should be, if what you're saying is true. But I'm not. I'm a pragmatist, remember? I believe what I see. And right now, I see a friend who's spiraling, who's convinced himself of something fantastical. So, let's put it to the test. One photograph. If I drop dead tomorrow looking exactly like some gloomy portrait, well, then you were right, and I'll be the best-looking corpse in the morgue. If not, then you get some help. And we chalk this up to a really, really bad couple of weeks." Arthur stared at him, horrified. "Mark, I can't. I won't. It's a death sentence. Or it's a crazy theory that needs debunking." Mark countered, his bravado unwavering. "Come on, Artie. For Eliza. For your own sanity. If this thing is truly what you say it is, then we need to know. And if it's not, then you need to know." He stepped towards the shrouded camera, his hand reaching for the cloth. "What do you say? One shot. For science. For skepticism. For a good story, if nothing else." Arthur felt trapped. Mark's challenge, born of disbelief and a misplaced sense of bravado, was a direct assault on the terrible truth Arthur had uncovered. But a perverse part of him, the part that still desperately wanted to be wrong, felt a flicker of something else. What if Mark was right? What if it was all in his head? The thought was a lifeline, however tenuous. And if he refused, Mark would likely never let it go, perhaps even spread stories about his deteriorating mental state. Reluctantly, almost imperceptibly, Arthur nodded. Mark's grin widened. "All right then, Nightfall. Let's make some morbid art." Chapter 3. Echoes in Emulsion. The decision, once made, hung in the air like a shroud. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out on his palms as Mark, with a theatrical flourish, pulled the black cloth off the camera. It sat there, gleaming dully, its lens a dark, vacant eye that seemed to absorb the very light of the room. Mark, however, appeared entirely unfazed. His bravado a stark contrast to Arthur's visceral dread. He struck a mock-heroic pose, one hand on his hip, chin jutting out. "All right, maestro," he declared, "compose my doom. Make it dramatic. Maybe I should be clutching my chest, or perhaps a look of existential terror." Arthur couldn't even summon a weak smile. "Mark, this isn't funny. Humor is how I cope with the potentially absurd." "Artie," Mark retorted, though a flicker of something unease briefly crossed his face before being quickly masked. "Now, what do you want your next alleged victim?" Arthur's hands trembled as he began the familiar, now horrifying, ritual of setting up the shot. He positioned Mark near the window, the same spot where Eliza had sat, a fact that sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He tried to dissuade Mark one last time. "Please, Mark, we don't have to do this. I believe it enough for both of us." Mark just shook his head, his expression hardening with a stubborn resolve. "Nope, we're committed now. Think of it as an experiment. A very, very creepy experiment. Besides," he added, a touch more seriously, "if you're right, then this thing needs to be dealt with, and we need definitive proof, something more than a wilted houseplant." Arthur draped the dark cloth over his head. The familiar scent of the camera, ozonic, metallic, and faintly of dust, enveloping him. The world outside vanished, replaced by the inverted image of Mark on the ground glass. Mark was attempting a nonchalant pose, leaning against the window frame, arms crossed, a slight smirk on his lips. But even in the dim, monochrome view, Arthur could see the forced quality of his nonchalance, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted almost imperceptibly. The camera, it seemed, revealed more than just surfaces. Arthur focused, the image sharpening, and as it did, a strange thing happened. Mark, in his attempt to look casual, shifted his weight, and his foot skidded slightly on the polished wooden floor. He caught himself quickly, a fleeting look of surprise flashing across his features before he resettled into his pose, perhaps a little less confidently. It was a tiny, almost unnoticeable mishap. Over in a second, Arthur, his nerves frayed, his attention hyper-focused, barely registered it consciously, but his finger was already on the pneumatic bulb. He took the shot. Flump hiss. The camera's soft exhalation seemed to carry a note of quiet satisfaction. Mark let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Well, did you capture my impending demise? Do I look suitably tragic?" Arthur pulled off the dark cloth, his face pale. "I don't know what it captured, Mark. Let's just develop it." The darkroom felt colder than usual, the red safe light casting demonic shadows on their faces. Mark, despite his earlier bravado, was noticeably quieter now, watching Arthur's every move with an intensity that betrayed his underlying apprehension. Arthur slid the exposed glass plate into the developer, his hands remarkably steady despite the tremor in his soul. He had a horrifying feeling of inevitability, like an executioner going about his grim, preordained task. The image began to emerge, slowly at first, then with increasing clarity. Mark's form materialized, leaning against the window. His expression, in the photograph, was not the confident smirk he'd been affecting. Instead, it was one of surprise, a slight imbalance, his body caught in that fractional moment of his foot slipping. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, as if in a small, involuntary gasp. In his position, one leg was angled awkwardly, his weight unnaturally distributed, as if he were about to fall, or had just narrowly avoided it. It was a strange, unposed, accidental moment. Frozen in time, there was nothing overtly ominous about it. No visible signs of injury or death like in Eliza's portrait. No wilting like the fern. Just an accident waiting to happen. Or an accident captured mid-occurrence. Arthur stared at it, a confusing mixture of relief and unease swirling within him. It wasn't what he'd expected. There was no clear premonition of doom. "Well?" Mark pressed, peering over his shoulder. "What do you see? Am I about to be hit by a bus? Struck by lightning?" Arthur shook his head. "It's odd. It's you slipping. That moment your foot slid on the floor. Mark frowned, recalling the minor incident. That's it? That's the big, scary prophecy? I slip and fall? I do that 3 times a week just getting out of bed. He sounded almost disappointed, but Arthur could also detect a note of relieved bravado returning to his voice. So, your killer camera just captures clumsy moments now? Maybe it's losing its touch. Arthur didn't reply. He moved the plate to the fixer, the image solidifying, becoming permanent. While it wasn't the overt death sentence he dreaded for Mark, there was still something profoundly unsettling about the photograph. The camera had chosen to capture that specific, uncontrolled instant out of all the moments Mark had stood there. It had focused on an accident, a loss of balance. It felt like a different kind of foreshadowing, less direct, perhaps, but no less unnerving. They made a print. Pinned up to dry, Mark surprised. Off-balance image seemed almost comical, a stark contrast to the tragic beauty of Eliza's portrait. Mark clapped Arthur on the shoulder, his relief palpable. See, Artie? Nothing. A bit of a clumsy photo, that's all. Maybe the camera just likes action shots. You've been stressing yourself out, man. It's grief. It's understandable. But this thing, he gestured to the camera, which Arthur had already recovered with the cloth, is just an old piece of kit. A bit creepy, maybe, but not a harbinger of doom. Arthur wanted to believe him. Oh, how he wanted to. But the image of the fern, the irrefutable proof of its decay, was still fresh in his mind. And Eliza? What about Eliza, Mark? He asked, his voice low. What about the fern? Mark's confidence wavered slightly. Eliza, that was a tragedy, Artie. A horrible coincidence that your photo seemed to echo. The fern? Plenty. Maybe he was already sick. Maybe the chemicals in your darkroom. The lack of light under that focusing cloth. He was grasping at straws, and they both knew it. But for now, Mark chose the path of denial, or at least, of determined skepticism. Look, get some rest, Artie. Seriously. And maybe put that camera away for a while. For a long while. He gave Arthur a concerned look, then, with a final, uncertain glance at the print of himself, he left. Arthur was alone again, with the photograph of Mark and his own gnawing fear. Had he been wrong? Had the camera's power somehow fluctuated? Or was it more insidious? Its predictions more subtle this time? He spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious limbo. Every time the phone rang, his heart leaped into his throat, expecting news of some terrible accident involving Mark. He replayed Mark's slip in his mind, the awkward angle of his body in the photograph. It seemed so minor, so insignificant. Yet, the camera had chosen to highlight it. The following morning, the call came. It wasn't the police. It was Mark's wife, Sarah, her voice tight with panic and tears. Arthur, it's Mark. He's had an accident. A stupide, freak accident. Arthur's blood ran cold. What happened? He was at the studio, Sarah sobbed, climbing a ladder to fix a loose light fixture. He slipped. He fell. He broke his leg badly. Multiple fractures. And he hit his head. He's unconscious. Arthur. They don't know how bad it is. Arthur sank into a chair, the phone clattering from his numb fingers. He stared at the print of Mark, his figure caught in that moment of imbalance, his leg at that awkward angle. It wasn't a direct depiction of the fall from the ladder, not like Eliza's portrait had been a direct depiction of her death, but it was the essence of it, the slip, the loss of control, the vulnerability, the awkward, damaging angle of the limb. The camera hadn't shown the exact future, but it had shown the mechanism of the impending disaster, the fatal flaw in that moment. The pattern was undeniable, more horrifying now in its subtlety. It didn't just predict, it understood causality. It saw the seeds of calamity in the smallest of missteps. The acquaintance who had challenged his paranoia had met a fate identical in its core nature to the one frozen in the photograph. Arthur Finch was not just a photographer. He was a reluctant prophet of misfortune, his lens a crystal ball reflecting the myriad ways life could break, shatter, and end. The news of Mark's accident, and its chilling correlation to the photograph, plunged Arthur into a new depth of despair. It was no longer just about death. It was about any form of catastrophic misfortune. The camera's curse was versatile, its malevolence adaptable. He felt a crushing weight of responsibility, not just for Mark's injuries, but for his own reckless decision to proceed with the photograph, even under duress. Mark's bravado, his skeptical challenge, now seemed like the tragic hubris of a Greek hero facing an inexorable, unseen fate. Arthur visited Mark in the hospital. Seeing his friend pale and unconscious, his legs swathed in a mountain of plaster, tubes and wires connecting him to beeping machines, was a torment. Sarah was there, her eyes red-rimmed, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. She looked at Arthur with a mixture of gratitude for his presence and a desperate need for answers he couldn't possibly provide. He mumbled words of comfort, of hope, but they felt hollow, a mockery in the face of the terrible knowledge he carried. He couldn't bring himself to look at Mark for long. Every glance was a fresh accusation, a reminder of the camera's insidious power. Back in his apartment, the photograph of Mark, the accidental slip, the surprised expression, now seemed like a taunt. It was a puzzle piece he hadn't fully understood until the picture it formed was revealed in devastating clarity. He found himself obsessively scrutinizing all the photographs he had taken with the cursed camera, Eliza's tragic portrait, the withered fern, and now Mark's premonition of his fall. He spread them out on his workbench, the dim light casting long, dancing shadows, making the figures in the prints seem almost to move, to breathe. He looked closer, his eyes straining, searching for something, anything he might have missed. And then he saw it, or rather, he began to sense at first a subtle wrongness in the emulsion itself. Something that wasn't part of the main subject but lurked in the peripheries, in the deep shadows, in the very grain of the image. In Eliza's portrait, in the darkest corner behind her chair, he now discerned an almost imperceptible shape, a faint, shadowy outline that, if he squinted and tilted the print just so, vaguely resembled a distorted, elongated human skull, its empty sockets seeming to gaze directly at Eliza. He'd never noticed it before. It was so faint, so cleverly integrated into the background shadows, that it could easily be dismissed as a trick of the light, a random pattern in the grain. But now, knowing what he knew, it screamed at him. His heart hammered against his ribs. With trembling hands, he picked up the print of the fern. He scanned its surface, his gaze darting from frond to frond into the blurred background. And there, amongst the indistinct shapes of his apartment wall, was another faint anomaly. A tiny, almost microscopic series of interwoven lines, like a spider's web, but more intricate, more sinister, clinging to the base of the frond that had withered. It looked like a fungal growth, a spectral blight captured in the silver. He hadn't seen it when he'd first examined the print. His attention focused solely on the obvious decay of the frond itself. Now it was undeniably there, a hidden signature of the camera's destructive intent. Finally, with a sense of mounting dread, he turned to Mark's photograph. He searched the image, his eyes raking over every detail of Mark's surprised face, his awkwardly angled body, the window frame, the floor. For a long moment, he saw nothing. Then, his gaze fell upon the reflection in the window pane behind Mark, a reflection that should have shown the interior of his apartment. But mixed within the faint, ghostly images of his bookshelves and easel was something else, a distorted, almost translucent figure, impossibly tall and thin, with arms that seemed too long, its form contorted as if it were falling, or perhaps causing a fall. It was like a specter caught in mid-motion, a fleeting glimpse of the unseen agent of Mark's misfortune. These were the echoes in the emulsion, the specters in the silver. Tiny, almost invisible clues, hidden within the fabric of the photographs themselves, prefiguring the exact nature of the doom that would befall each subject. The skull for Eliza's death, the spectral blight for the fern's decay, the falling specter for Mark's accident. The camera wasn't just showing the future, it was embedding its dark magic, its malevolent signature, into the very images it created. It was a horrifying revelation. The camera wasn't just a passive recorder of a predetermined fate. It was an active participant, subtly manipulating the image to include these ghostly harbingers, these almost subliminal death warrants. Arthur felt a profound, soul-deep chill. This was an intelligence at work, a cunning, patient, and utterly evil consciousness. He realized now that his initial dismissals of these subtle details, if he'd even registered them at all, were part of the camera's insidious design. It wanted its predictions to be seen, but only in retrospect, only when the tragedy had struck, amplifying the horror, deepening the despair of its chosen operator. Desperate to understand, to find some way to break this cycle, Arthur considered his next move. He couldn't photograph another living thing, not after Mark. The guilt was too immense, the risk too catastrophic. But what about inanimate objects? Truly inanimate, not just a living plant. He'd tried still lives before, the fruit, the books, the porcelain dancer. He'd seen a certain weight, a disturbing stillness in those prints. But no overt harm had befallen them. They hadn't decayed or shattered. Or had they? He hadn't paid close enough attention, his focus then on the technical marvel of the camera, not its malevolent potential. Perhaps the effect was different on things that weren't alive. Or perhaps the curse only manifested when the subject possessed some form of life force, however minimal. He had to know. He looked around his small apartment, his gaze falling on an old, chipped teacup that had belonged to his grandmother. It was purely inanimate, a piece of fired clay, holding only sentimental value. Surely, no harm could come to a teacup. With a renewed, albeit fearful, sense of purpose, he set up the camera again. The process was now fraught with a sickening dread, each step a reluctant concession to the camera's will. He placed the teacup on a small table, its faded floral pattern a poignant reminder of a gentler past. He focused, his hands surprisingly steady, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions, fear, scientific curiosity, and a desperate, almost prayerful hope that this time nothing would happen. He squeezed a shutter bulb. Thwump hiss. The familiar sound now seemed to carry a note of derision. He rushed to the darkroom, his heart pounding. He slid the plate into the developer and waited. Nothing. The plate remained blank. A milky, featureless expanse. He tried another plate. Same result. And another. Blank. 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 It was as if the camera refused. It would not, or perhaps could not, photograph the teacup. He tried other inanimate objects, a metal letter opener, a stone paperweight, a glass bottle. Each time, the plates emerged from the developer utterly blank, untouched by light or chemistry. It was infuriating and deeply unsettling. The camera seemed to possess a will of its own, a selectivity. It was interested only in subjects that possessed some form of life, some vitality it could corrupt or extinguish. It fed on life, and the inanimate held no sustenance for it. No interest. The specter in the camera was a predator, and it was a discerning one. Arthur was left staring at the useless, blank plates. The camera's refusal, a chilling confirmation of its parasitic nature. It wasn't just a tool. It was a hunter, and it was waiting patiently for him to bring it new prey. Chapter 4. The lens reflects the void. The camera's refusal to photograph the inanimate objects was a chilling revelation, confirming its predatory nature. It wasn't interested in mere depiction. It craved life, the subtle energies that animated flesh and frond, energies it could twist and extinguish. Arthur felt a new layer of despair settle over him. He was tethered to a monster with an appetite, a monster he had unwittingly fed, and whose hunger he now understood with horrifying clarity. He couldn't destroy it. The fear of unleashing something worse, or of simply failing and inviting retribution, was too great. He couldn't use it on the living, not after Eliza and Mark. And now he knew he couldn't even trick it or placate it with inert subjects. He was trapped in a horrifying stasis, the camera a brooding, malevolent presence in his small apartment. A constant reminder of his guilt and his powerlessness. He began to feel like a prisoner, his apartment his cell, the camera his warden. Sleep became a battlefield of nightmares. His waking hours a tightrope walk of anxiety. He ate little, his reflection in the bathroom mirror showing a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger. He knew he couldn't go on like this. He had to understand what he was dealing with. If he couldn't destroy it, perhaps he could find a way to contain it, to neutralize its power, or at the very least, to learn its history, to glean some clue from its past that might offer a path forward. The antique dealer, the wraith-like man from Curios and Relics, was his only link to the camera's origins. The thought of returning to that dusty, mausoleum-like shop filled him with a profound reluctance, but it was a lead he had to pursue, summoning what little courage he had left. Arthur made his way back to the narrow, shadowed street where the shop lurked. The faded sign, Curios and Relics, seemed even more ominous now, a gateway to forgotten horrors. He pushed open the creaking door, the little bell above it jangling a discordant welcome. The shop was as he remembered, a chaotic labyrinth of discarded objects, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else, that faint, ozonic tang he now irrevocably associated with the camera. The proprietor materialized from a gloom, his clouded agate eyes fixing on Arthur with an unnerving lack of surprise, as if he'd been expecting him. "Ah," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper. "The photographer. You've returned. She has made an impression, I take it." Arthur's hand instinctively went to the small, hidden pocket where he now kept a tiny, folded print of the withered fern, a constant, tangible reminder of the camera's power. "The camera," Arthur began, his voice hoarse. "Where did you get it? What do you know about it?" The old man smiled, a slow, reptilian stretching of his thin lips. "Knowledge has a price, young man, and some knowledge is best left undisturbed. People have been hurt," Arthur said, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "A friend is dead. Another is in the hospital. This camera, it's not just an antique. It's dangerous." The proprietor's smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened, acquiring a hint of something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "All things of power are dangerous in the wrong hands," he murmured. "Or perhaps in the right hands for certain purposes." He gestured vaguely towards a dusty, leather-bound ledger on his cluttered counter. "Its provenance is fragmented. It has passed through many hands. Few have kept it for long. They either tire of its demands or it tires of them." He paused, his gaze unervingly direct. "It tends to attract those with a certain artistic temperament, a desire to capture more than just the surface of things." Arthur pressed him. "Were there others? Other owners who experienced what I've experienced?" The old man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Let us just say its history is littered with unfortunate incidents. Sudden illnesses, freak accidents, unexplained disappearances. Often, the camera is found again, sometimes years later, waiting patiently for a new custodian." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of old paper and something indefinably metallic. "There was a portraitist in Vienna in the late 19th century, renowned for the lifelike quality of his images. His subjects, however, had a tendency to meet untimely ends, often mirroring the very expressions or poses he so brilliantly captured. He vanished. Of course, then there was a society photographer in Paris in the 20s. Her clients were the toast of the town until they began to suffer a series of spectacular and fatal misfortunes. She, too, disappeared. And so it goes. A trail of beautiful, haunting photographs, and a parallel trail of sorrow and unexplained tragedy." He spoke of these horrors with a chilling detachment, as if recounting items from an inventory. Arthur felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't just a single cursed object. It was a serial killer moving through history, leaving a wake of devastation, passed from one unsuspecting artist to another. "What?" Arthur whispered. "What does it want?" The old man shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement. "Perhaps it simply is. Like a whirlpool, it draws things in. Or perhaps it feeds. On life. On emotion. On the little spark that makes us more than just clay. Who can say? Some say it houses a spirit, an entity bound to the silver and glass. Others whisper of a pact made long ago, by its creator, a bargain for artistic immortality that came at a terrible price. A price paid by every subsequent owner and their subjects. He tapped a long, yellowed fingernail on the counter. What matters, photographer, is that you now possess it. And it possesses a part of you, does it not? You feel its pull, its hunger. Arthur couldn't deny it. Even now, standing in this dusty crypt of forgotten things, he felt the camera's presence back in his apartment, a cold, demanding weight in his consciousness. Is there any way to stop it? Arthur asked, his voice barely audible. To break the curse? The old man was silent for a long moment, his clouded eyes seeming to look through Arthur into some distant, shadowy realm. All things that are made can be unmade, he said finally, his voice a low murmur. But the unmaking of such a thing, it requires a commensurate sacrifice, or will stronger than its own. Few possess such will, once they have looked through its lens and seen what it can do. He offered no more, no specific rituals, no easy solutions. Just cryptic pronouncements and a chilling affirmation of the camera's ancient, malevolent power. Arthur left the shop with more questions than answers, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the camera's dark lineage. He was just the latest in a long line of cursed photographers, unwitting conduits for an evil that stretched back generations. The lens didn't just reflect the void. It was a void, a hungry emptiness that consumed life and light, leaving only sorrow and echoes in its wake. Back in his apartment, the camera seemed even more menacing, its polished surfaces reflecting his own pale, haunted face. The knowledge of its history, its previous custodians and their grim fates, settled upon him like a physical weight. He was no longer just dealing with a cursed object. He was entangled in a legacy of horror. He knew he couldn't just put it away, couldn't ignore it. Its demands, as the antique dealer had put it, would only grow stronger. He felt an overwhelming urge to be rid of it, a desperate, primal need to sever his connection to this instrument of doom. He thought of the river again, its dark, swirling waters. He imagined the camera sinking into the silt, lost forever. But then he remembered the dealer's words. It is found again, sometimes years later, waiting patiently. Could he truly be sure it would stay gone? Or would it simply find its way to another unsuspecting victim, continuing its deadly work? He decided he had to try. He couldn't live with it anymore. He wrapped the camera in the black cloth, then in several layers of old newspapers, tying the bundle securely with twine. It felt like preparing a body for burial. He put the bundle into a heavy canvas bag, weighted it with several old bricks he found in his building's refuse area, and then, under the cloak of a moonless night, he made his way to the city's industrial waterfront. The river was a black, oily ribbon, reflecting the harsh, indifferent lights of the distant factories. The air was cold, smelling of brine and pollution. He found a deserted pier, its timbers rotten and creaking under his weight. He stood at the edge, the heavy bag in his hand, his heart pounding. This was it. He would send it to the bottom, consign it to the darkness. He swung the bag, ready to hurl it into the depths. But as he did, the twine around the bundle seemed to snag on a protruding nail on the pier's railing. The bag ripped, the camera, still partially wrapped, tumbling out. It didn't fall into the water. Instead, it landed with a sickening thud on the hard, unforgiving concrete of the pier, just inches from the edge. And as it landed, one of the bricks dislodged from the bag and struck his foot with painful force, causing him to cry out and stumble backwards, narrowly avoiding a fall into the black water himself. He stared, breathless, at the camera. It lay there, seemingly undamaged, its lens, now partially uncovered, glinting up at him like a malevolent eye. It was as if it had refused to be discarded, as if it had actively engineered this outcome, this minor injury, this thwarted attempt. The message was clear. It would not be easily disposed of. It had a will, and it had ways of protecting itself. Defeated, his foot throbbing, a cold dread washing over him, Arthur picked up the camera. It felt heavier now, its presence more potent, more triumphant. He knew then that he was truly ensnared. The lens reflected the void, and the void was now reflecting him, holding him captive in its dark, unyielding gaze. His attempts to understand its origins had only deepened his terror. His attempt to discard it had resulted in injury and a chilling demonstration of its protective power. He was bound to it, perhaps for as long as he lived, or more likely, for as long as it allowed him to live. Chapter 5. Whispers from the Negative. The failed attempt to discard the camera left Arthur in a state of profound dejection. It was clear the object possessed some form of agency, an ability to influence events to ensure its own preservation. His throbbing foot was a constant, painful reminder of his impotence. The camera sat on his workbench, no longer covered, its presence a defiant assertion of its dominion over his life. He felt its unseen gaze on him constantly, a cold pressure at the back of his neck. The knowledge of its long, dark history, its succession of doomed custodians, offered no comfort, only a terrifying glimpse of his own potential future. He was adrift in a sea of supernatural horror, with no map and no shore in sight. He knew he couldn't simply wait for the camera to tire of him, as the antique dealer had so chillingly put it. He had to find someone, anyone, who might understand the nature of such a curse. Someone who dealt with the occult, with artifacts that defied rational explanation. The idea of seeking out such an individual would have seemed ludicrous to him just weeks ago, but his reality had been so violently reconfigured that the irrational now seemed like the only logical path. He spent days scouring the internet, venturing into the shadowy corners of forums dedicated to paranormal investigation, occult studies, and cursed objects. Most of it was nonsense, fanciful tales, and amateur ghost stories. But eventually, he found a recurring name, mentioned with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. Dr. Alastair Thorne, no relation to Mark, a coincidence Arthur found grimly ironic. Dr. Thorne was described as a reclusive scholar, a former university professor of comparative mythology and folklore who had, according to rumor, delved too deeply into the esoteric, leading to his ostracization from mainstream academia. He now supposedly consulted privately on matters of an unusual nature. Finding a way to contact him was difficult. He had no public listing, no website, but Arthur, driven by a desperate hope, eventually managed to trace a contact email through an obscure academic journal where Thorne had published a paper years ago on sympathetic malevolence in inanimate objects. The title alone sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. He composed a carefully worded email, omitting the most unbelievable details but hinting at a disturbing antique artifact with potentially harmful properties. To his surprise, he received a curt reply within hours. Bring it. Thursday, 2 p.m. Address to follow. The address, when it arrived, was for a brownstone in a quiet, old money part of the city, a far cry from the dusty chaos of curios and relics. On Thursday, Arthur found himself standing before an imposing oak door, the cursed camera heavy in its specially padded bag at his side. He felt a tremor of fear, but also a faint flicker of hope. This was it, his last resort. The door was opened by a stern-looking woman who introduced herself as Thorne's assistant, then led Arthur through a hallway lined with towering bookshelves crammed with ancient, leather-bound tomes into a large, dimly lit study. The room smelled of old paper, beeswax, and a faint, unidentifiable incense. Dr. Alastair Thorne sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a man who seemed to have stepped out of another century. He was elderly, with a mane of white hair, piercing blue eyes, and a face etched with the lines of deep thought and, perhaps, profound disillusionment. He gestured for Arthur to sit, his gaze already fixed on the bag Arthur carried. The artifact? Thorne asked, his voice a low, cultured rumble. Arthur nodded, his throat dry. He carefully removed the camera, placing it on the polished surface of the desk. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined it, not touching it, but observing it with an almost preternatural intensity. The camera, in this scholarly, rarefied atmosphere, seemed even more alien, its dark wood and tarnished brass, exuding a palpable aura of antiquity and menace. "Tell me about it," Thorne said, his gaze never leaving the camera. Arthur began his story, starting with its acquisition, the initial stunning photographs, Eliza's death, the withered fern, Mark's accident, the ghostly apparitions in the emulsion. The camera's refusal to photograph inanimate objects, and his failed attempt to dispose of it. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice raw with emotion, laying bare the full extent of the horror. Thorne listened patiently, without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Arthur finally finished, an exhausted silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Thorne remained silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him, his eyes still on the camera. Then he spoke. "What you have here, Mr. Finch," he said slowly, "is not merely a cursed object. It is a vessel, a prison, perhaps, or a conduit for a predatory consciousness." He rose and walked around the desk, circling the camera slowly, like a naturalist observing a dangerous specimen. "There are certain markings," he murmured, pointing to almost invisible etchings near the lens housing. Etchings Arthur had never noticed, so faint were they, almost blending into the grain of the wood. "These are not decorative. They are sigils, old ones, from a tradition of craft that intertwines artistry with darker practices." He continued, "The entity bound to or operating through this device appears to function on a principle of sympathetic resonance. It captures not just an image, but an echo of the subject's vital essence, their anima, if you will. By fixing this essence onto a plate, it creates a link, a point of vulnerability. The foreshadowing elements you've observed in the photographs, the skull, the blight, the falling specter, these are not merely predictions. They're the entity's way of focusing its intent, of shaping the misfortune it intends to inflict. It's a form of targeted, sympathetic magic, enacted through the medium of photography." Arthur listened, a cold knot of understanding tightening in his stomach. Thorne's explanation, while couched in occult terminology, resonated with a chilling accuracy to his own experiences. "The refusal to photograph inanimate objects is also consistent," Thorne went on. "Such an entity feeds on life force, on the disruption of vital energies. A teacup offers no such sustenance. It is, in essence, a psychic vampire, but one that uses a sophisticated, almost artistic methodology." Thorne then produced a small, velvet-lined box. From it, he took a peculiar object, a lens of smoked quartz, set in a silver filigree handle. "May I?" he asked, gesturing towards the camera. Arthur nodded. Thorne held the smoked quartz lens over the camera's own lens, peering through it intently. After a moment, he drew back, his expression grim. "The aura is potent," he said quietly, "and hungry. You were wise not to attempt to destroy it forcefully. Such actions, with an artifact of this nature, can have explosive and unpredictable consequences, often turning the entity's full malice upon the one attempting its destruction." He looked at Arthur, his blue eyes filled with a grave seriousness. "You realize, Mr. Finch, that this entity is likely drawing power from each life it affects, from each tragedy it orchestrates through your hands? Each photograph you take, each misfortune that follows strengthens it, and its connection to you also deepens with each use." Arthur felt a chill pass through him. He had suspected as much, but to hear it stated so baldly by an expert was terrifying. He felt a growing, oppressive presence, not just from the camera itself, but within his own mind, a subtle, persuasive whisper that sometimes urged him to pick up the camera, to find a new subject, to experience that dark thrill of its perfect, deadly clarity. It was a siren song he was struggling to resist. The camera wasn't just an external object anymore. It was beginning to feel like an extension of some dark, burgeoning part of himself. The whispers from the negative were becoming whispers in his own soul. Thorne saw the look on his face. "It is trying to bind you to it, Mr. Finch, to make you its willing accomplice, its permanent custodian. That is the ultimate fate of those who keep such objects for too long. Chapter 6. Developing Despair. Dr. Thorne's words resonated with a terrifying clarity, echoing the subtle, insidious whispers Arthur had begun to hear in the recesses of his own mind. The camera wasn't just a cursed object he possessed. It was a predatory entity actively working to possess him, to transform him from an unwilling operator into a compliant servant. The realization sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. He was not merely a victim of circumstance. He was a target, a potential host for a timeless, malevolent consciousness. He looked at Thorne, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. "What can I do? Is there any way to sever this connection? To stop it before it completely consumes me?" Thorne regarded him with a somber, pitying expression. "Such bindings are not easily broken, Mr. Finch, especially when they have been reinforced by repeated use, by the shedding of life force. However unintentional, the entity has tasted power through you. It will not relinquish its new conduit willingly." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the camera, which sat on his desk like a dark, brooding idol. There are rituals, of course, countermeasures, but they are perilous, demanding immense willpower and often a significant personal sacrifice. And they're not always successful. Sometimes they merely anger the entity or bind it even more irrevocably to the interloper. Arthur felt a flicker of despair. Sacrifice. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. What kind of sacrifice? His sanity? His life? Are you saying there's no hope? Thorne's expression softened slightly. There is always hope, Mr. Finch, however slim. But you must understand the gravity of your situation. You are in a spiritual battle with an ancient, cunning, and utterly ruthless adversary. You cannot fight it on its terms, using its own tools. That path leads only to deeper enslavement. He advised Arthur to resist the camera's pull, to starve it by refusing to use it, despite the insidious whispers and the growing pressure it would undoubtedly exert. He suggested certain protective measures, small rituals of warding and cleansing, though he cautioned that these would likely only offer temporary respite, a way to strengthen Arthur's own will, rather than a solution to the camera's curse. He also gave Arthur a small, smooth piece of obsidian. "Carry this with you," he said. "It may help to absorb some of the negative energy, to ground you when the entity's influence becomes too strong." Arthur left Thorne's study with a few fragile strands of hope, but also with a much deeper understanding of the terrifying nature of his predicament. The camera was not just a tool. It was a conscious, predatory force, and he was locked in a struggle for his very soul. The days that followed were a torment. The camera's presence in his apartment became almost unbearable. He could feel its hunger, its silent, incessant demand. The whispers in his mind grew more insistent, more persuasive, sometimes taking on the cadence of his own thoughts, urging him to just take one more picture to feel that power, that unique clarity. He would find himself standing before it, his hand reaching out, only to snatch it back at the last moment, clutching the obsidian Dr. Thorne had given him until his knuckles were white. He tried the warding rituals, chanting unfamiliar words in the dim light of his apartment, burning sage until the air was thick with its pungent smoke. These practices offered fleeting moments of clarity, a brief quieting of the mental static, but the camera's pull remained, a constant undertow threatening to drag him under. His financial situation, already precarious, began to deteriorate rapidly. He neglected his freelance work, unable to concentrate, unable to face the thought of picking up any camera, let alone his professional digital one. Bills piled up, threatening letters arrived, and the gnawing anxiety of impending eviction began to compound his supernatural terrors. He was being squeezed from all sides, the mundane pressures of survival intertwining with the existential horror of his cursed predicament. It was during this period of intense vulnerability that an old acquaintance, a gallery owner named Julian Croft, contacted him. Croft was a man of expensive tastes and questionable ethics, known for his ability to procure unique, often controversial, pieces of art. He'd heard, through the grapevine, that Arthur had come into possession of an extraordinary antique camera, one that produced images of unparalleled, almost unsettling realism. Croft, always on the lookout for the next sensation, was intrigued. He arranged a meeting, his tone smooth and persuasive, hinting at a lucrative commission. Arthur was wary, but also desperate. The thought of earning some money, of staving off financial ruin, was a powerful lure, even against the backdrop of his terror. When they met, Croft was all charm and insinuation. He spoke of a wealthy, eccentric client who collected photographs of a certain intensity, images that captured the raw essence of the human condition. He didn't need to elaborate. Arthur understood the subtext. Croft was looking for something dark, something that pushed boundaries. "I hear your new acquisition has a rather unique way of capturing its subjects," Croft said, his eyes gleaming with avaricious curiosity. A quality of finality, perhaps. Arthur felt a chill. Had word of Eliza's death, and its connection to his photograph, somehow reached Croft's ears, twisted into some grotesque artistic selling point? Or was Croft merely sensing the camera's dark aura, drawn to it like a moth to a Stygian flame? The commission would be substantial. Croft pressed, naming a figure that made Arthur's head spin. It was enough to solve all his immediate financial problems, to buy him time, perhaps even to fund a more concerted effort to fight the camera's influence, to seek further help from Thorne. But the price was to use the camera again, to knowingly point it at another human being. The thought was repulsive, yet the pressure was immense. Croft was relentless, painting a picture of artistic triumph, of financial salvation. He even had a specific subject in mind, a reclusive, terminally ill author named Silas Blackwood, who, according to Croft, wished to have a final, unflinching portrait made, a memento mori of his own choosing. "He understands the risks, Arthur." Croft purred, though Arthur doubted Silas Blackwood understood the true nature of this camera's risks. "He wants his end to be art." Arthur was torn. The money was a lifeline. The subject was already dying, perhaps making the act less monstrous in some twisted way. Or was that just a convenient rationalization, a whisper from the camera itself, urging him to succumb? He remembered Dr. Thorne's warning. It will try to bind you to it, to make you its willing accomplice. Was this it? Was this the moment of his ultimate surrender? He tried to refuse, but his resolve was crumbling under the combined weight of his desperation and Croft's insidious persuasion. He found himself agreeing, his voice a hoarse whisper, his soul recoiling even as the words left his lips. Croft smiled, a triumphant, predatory gleam in his eyes. The arrangements were made. Arthur was to visit Silas Blackwood at his secluded country estate the following weekend. He spent the intervening days in a state of self-loathing and mounting dread. He meticulously cleaned the camera, preparing the glass plates, his actions feeling automated, as if he were a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand. He told himself he would be careful, that he would try to compose a shot that was neutral, devoid of any overt foreshadowing. A foolish hope, he knew, given the camera's demonstrated cunning. Silas Blackwood's estate was a Gothic, ivy-covered mansion, brooding under a perpetually overcast sky. Blackwood himself was a skeletal figure, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity, his body ravaged by illness, but his mind still sharp, almost unervingly perceptive. He greeted Arthur with a strange, knowing smile. "So, you're the one with the camera that sees beyond the veil." Blackwood rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Julian has told me remarkable things." Arthur felt a flush of shame and fear. He set up the camera in Blackwood's dimly lit library, the shelves groaning under the weight of countless ancient books, the air thick with the scent of dust, decay, and expensive cigars. Blackwood positioned himself in a large, throne-like armchair, his hands like bundles of twigs gripping the armrests. He looked directly into the lens, his expression a mixture of defiance and a strange, almost eager anticipation. Arthur, his heart heavy, his hands clammy, draped the dark cloth over his head. He focused on Blackwood's ravaged face, searching for some neutral angle, some way to mitigate the camera's curse. But Blackwood's eyes, even the inverted image on the ground glass, seemed to challenge him, to demand the full, unvarnished truth of his impending end. Arthur squeezed the shutter bulb. Flump hiss. The sound seemed to echo in the vast, silent library, a sigh of finality. Later, back in the desperate solitude of his darkroom, Arthur developed the plate. The image that emerged was horrifying. Blackwood's face was a mask of agony, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended physical pain, his mouth open in a silent scream. But it was the detail in the background that made Arthur's blood run cold. Behind Blackwood's chair, barely visible in the deep shadows, was a new, macabre embellishment, a specter he hadn't seen, hadn't even conceived of when taking the shot. It was a grotesque, shadowy figure, hunched and skeletal, with long, needle-like fingers. Its form partially coalesced from the swirling patterns of the dark wood paneling. One of those shadowy, needle-like fingers was extended, touching Blackwood's temple, as if injecting some unspeakable horror directly into his mind. It was a portrait not just of death, but of torment, of a soul being ripped apart. Arthur stared at the print, his stomach churning. He had tried to control it, to take a harmless shot, but the camera had once again asserted its will, adding its own monstrous signature, its own horrifying prediction. He delivered the print to Croft, unable to look him in the eye, taking the blood money with a sense of profound self-disgust. 3 days later, the news broke. Silas Blackwood was dead. He hadn't just succumbed to his illness. He'd been found in his library, in his armchair, his face contorted in a mask of unimaginable terror, dead for what the coroner described as a massive, inexplicable stroke, accompanied by signs of extreme psychological distress. His death was swift, brutal, and a direct, horrifying echo of the terror depicted in Arthur's photograph, right down to the silent scream and the look of a mind shattered by some unseen, unbearable horror. The guilt was a living thing inside Arthur, clawing at his insides. He had become what he most feared, a willing participant in the camera's deadly art. And as he caught his own reflection in the camera's polished lens, he saw, for a fleeting, terrifying instant, his own features subtly altered, his eyes holding a cold, predatory gleam, a chilling glimpse of his own soul's decay under the camera's insidious, corrupting influence. Chapter 7. The Unseen Subject. The death of Silas Blackwood, so precisely and horribly mirrored by the photograph, was a devastating blow to Arthur's already fractured psyche. The blood money from Julian Croft felt like acid in his pocket, a tangible symbol of his corruption. He hadn't just documented a death. He had, in some terrible way, facilitated it, served it up to the hungry entity within the camera. Dr. Thorne's warnings about becoming a willing accomplice, about the camera binding him to its will, now echoed in his mind with the force of a death knell. The fleeting, distorted reflection he'd seen of himself in the camera's lens, the cold, predatory gleam in his eyes, haunted him. Was he losing himself? Was Arthur Finch, the sensitive artist, being slowly hollowed out and replaced by something else, something that resonated with the camera's dark frequency? He locked himself in his apartment, the curtains drawn, the world outside a distant, irrelevant hum. He couldn't face anyone, couldn't bear the thought of his own complicity. The camera sat on its workbench, no longer a mere object of fear, but a monument to his own moral collapse. It seemed to watch him with a smug, proprietary satisfaction. He spent days in a fugue state, tormented by guilt and the chilling realization of his own transformation. The whispers in his mind were no longer subtle. They were insistent, demanding, sometimes even taking on Blackwood's rasping voice or Eliza's sorrowful sigh. He tried to fight them, clutching the obsidian Dr. Thorne had given him, but its grounding effect felt weaker now. overwhelmed by the sheer force of the camera's influence and his own self-loathing. He knew he was at a precipice. If he didn't do something drastic, something to fight back, he would be utterly consumed. The idea of simply starting the camera by refusing to use it seemed impossible now. Its hunger was his hunger. Its desires were becoming entwined with his own. He had to find another way, a way to confront the entity, not just resist it. But how did one fight an unseen, intangible consciousness that lived in silver halide and shadows? A desperate, audacious plan began to form in his mind, born of equal parts terror and a wild, almost suicidal courage. If the camera captured the essence of its subjects, if it could reveal the hidden specters that presaged their doom, then what if he could somehow turn it upon the entity itself? What if he could force it to photograph its own malevolent consciousness? Could such an image reveal its nature, its weaknesses? Could it, perhaps, even trap or diminish the entity by capturing its essence, just as it did with its victims? It was a terrifying gamble. The entity was powerful, cunning. Attempting such a direct confrontation was fraught with peril. What if it retaliated with its full force? What if the act of trying to photograph it only strengthened it, or worse, allowed it to fully possess him? But the alternative, a slow, inexorable descent into becoming the camera's mindless slave, was even more horrifying. He had to try. He was already damned by his actions. What more did he have to lose? Apart from the last vestiges of his own soul, he began to prepare, though he had no clear idea what such an undertaking would entail. How did one photograph an invisible entity? He couldn't simply point the camera at an empty space. He needed a focus, a conduit. He thought of the moments when the camera's influence felt strongest, when the air in the room grew cold, when the whispers were loudest. These were the times, he reasoned, when the entity was most present, most active. He decided he would attempt the photograph during one of these manifestations, hoping to capture the entity in its raw, concentrated form. He spent a day meticulously cleaning his small apartment, removing anything that might interfere, anything that wasn't essential. He set up the camera in the center of the room, on its heavy tripod, aiming it towards the darkest corner, a space that always seemed to hold a particular chill, a certain oppressive weight. He loaded a fresh glass plate, his hand surprisingly steady, his fear now overlaid with a grim, almost fatalistic resolve. He had no dark cloth to hide under this time. He needed to be fully aware, to sense the entity's presence, to choose the exact moment to trigger the shutter. He sat in a chair opposite the camera, the obsidian clutched in his hand, and waited. Hours passed. The silence in the apartment was thick, charged with anticipation. The city outside faded into a distant murmur. He focused his mind, trying to reach out, to almost taunt the entity, to draw it forth. He thought of Eliza, of Mark, of Silas Blackwood, focusing on the pain, the guilt, the anger. He projected his defiance, his refusal to be a mere puppet. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The temperature dropped, a bone-deep chill seeping into his limbs. The familiar ozonic scent of the camera intensified, filling the air with its metallic tang. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to writhe with an unseen energy. And the whispers started, not just in his mind, but seemingly in the air around him, faint at first, then growing louder, a chorus of sibilant, accusatory voices. He could feel it, the entity's presence, a cold, malevolent intelligence focusing its attention on him, on the camera. It was a suffocating pressure, a palpable wave of malice. Arthur's heart pounded, his breath catching in his throat. But he held his ground, his gaze fixed on the dark corner where the shadows seemed thickest, most animate. Then he saw it, or rather, he perceived it. Not a distinct form, but a roiling, inky blackness within the shadows, a disturbance in the very fabric of the air, like heat haze over asphalt, but cold, dark, and imbued with an undeniable sentience. It was a vortex of pure negativity, a concentration of the camera's dark energy. This was it. This was the unseen subject. With a surge of adrenaline, that momentarily banished his fear. Arthur lunged for the pneumatic shutter bulb. He squeezed it. Thwumpus. The camera's sigh seemed louder this time, almost a gasp, as if it too were surprised, or perhaps violated. And then, all hell broke loose. The moment the shutter clicked, the roiling blackness in the corner exploded outwards, not with light, but with a shock wave of pure, icy force. A violent, spectral wind ripped through the apartment, sending papers flying, knocking books from shelves, and extinguishing the single candle he had lit. The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the window panes. The whispers intensified into a cacophony of shrieks and guttural growls, a symphony of rage and pain. Arthur was thrown back in his chair, the obsidian flying from his grasp. He felt an immense, crushing pressure on his chest, as if an invisible weight were trying to suffocate him. Objects around the room began to rattle and shake. A poltergeist fury unleashed. The camera on its tripod wobbled precariously. Arthur, gasping for breath, his ears ringing from the psychic assault, knew he had provoked something terrible. This wasn't just a passive entity anymore. It was an enraged, wounded beast. He scrambled on the floor, searching for the obsidian, his only small shield against the onslaught. He found it, its coldness a small anchor in the chaos. He had to get the plate. He had to see what, if anything, the camera had captured. He crawled towards the camera, shielding his head from unseen blows. The air thick with malevolent energy. He reached the camera, his fingers fumbling with the plate holder mechanism. He managed to remove it, clutching the heavy glass plate to his chest as if it were a holy relic. The spectral assault seemed to intensify, the room now a vortex of howling wind and bone-chilling cold. He knew he had to get to the darkroom, but it felt miles away, an impossible journey through a psychic storm. He pushed himself up, staggering towards the door, the plate held tight. The unseen subject of his desperate photograph, perhaps holding the only key to his survival or his utter damnation. The experiment had gone terribly, terrifyingly awry. He had sought to capture the specter, but he might have only succeeded in unleashing its full, unbridled fury. Chapter 8. Between Light and Shadow. The darkroom, usually his sanctuary, now felt like the eye of a storm. The spectral chaos raging in his living area was somewhat muffled here, though the bone-chilling cold persisted, and the air still thrummed with a palpable, hostile energy. Arthur's hands shook so violently he could barely slide the exposed glass plate into the developing tray. The red safe light cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the familiar clutter of bottles and trays into grotesque, menacing shapes. He rocked the tray with a desperate, almost prayerful intensity, his breath misting in the frigid air. What would it show? Had he captured anything at all? Or had the entity's fury overwhelmed the camera's mechanics, resulting in another blank plate, a testament to his folly? Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, slowly, agonizingly, an image began to coalesce in the developer. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, anything he could have imagined. It was not a clear depiction of a form, but a swirling, chaotic vortex of light and shadow, a maelstrom of abstract, tormented shapes. It was as if he had photographed the very essence of madness, of primordial chaos. There were hints of screaming faces, contorted limbs, and eyes burning with an unholy light, all dissolving into one another, a roiling, nightmarish tapestry. And at its heart, a core of absolute blackness, a void that seemed to draw in all light, all hope. This, then, was the face of his tormentor, the unseen subject. It was not a single entity, perhaps, but a legion, a composite horror. Or maybe it was formless, its appearance merely a reflection of the terror it inspired. Arthur stared at the developing image, a mixture of horror and estranged. Grim triumph coursing through him. He had seen it. He had captured a piece of it. But the triumph was short-lived. As the image solidified, the psychic pressure in the apartment seemed to intensify. The howls and shrieks from beyond the darkroom door growing more frenzied. The entity knew. It knew its likeness was being fixed, trapped in silver halide, and it was enraged. The darkroom door rattled violently in its frame, as if something immense were trying to break it down. Arthur knew he didn't have much time. He had to fix the image, make it permanent, before the entity destroyed him, or the plate, or both. He quickly moved the plate to the stop bath, then into the fixer, his heart pounding in his ears like a war drum. The image stabilized. The chaotic vortex of light and shadow now a permanent testament to his terrifying encounter. He had done it. He had a photograph of the Specter. But what now? What could he do with this horrifying artifact? He remembered Dr. Thorne's words. All things that are made can be unmade. It requires a commensurate sacrifice, or a will stronger than its own. And then, something else Thorne had said, a fragment of occult lore he'd briefly mentioned, almost as an aside, during their consultation. Something about a ritual of binding and transference. A dangerous and esoteric procedure used in extreme cases to neutralize or imprison entities bound to physical objects. Thorne had dismissed it as too perilous for an amateur, but Arthur, in his desperation, now clung to it as his only hope. He had called Thorne's office in a panic after his experiment, leaving a frantic message for the doctor. To his immense relief, Thorne, or rather his assistant, had called back within the hour, Thorne's voice grave, but steady over the line as Arthur breathlessly described what had happened and the resulting photograph. Thorne, upon hearing about the image, agreed that Arthur had stumbled into something unprecedented and incredibly dangerous. He conceded that, given the entity's direct and violent reaction, a more proactive, albeit high-risk, countermeasure was now unavoidable. The ritual of binding and transference, he explained, was designed to draw the entity out of its anchor object, in this case, the camera, and bind it to another, specifically prepared vessel, ideally one that could then be neutralized or sealed away. And the linchpin of this ritual, the focal point for drawing out and ensnaring the entity, was often a powerful, direct representation of the entity itself. Arthur's photograph. Thorne agreed to guide him, though he stressed the extreme dangers involved. He couldn't come to Arthur's apartment. To do so would be to invite the entity's direct attack upon himself as well. But he could provide the necessary instructions, the list of components, the incantations. The ritual, Thorne explained, would require Arthur to use the curse camera one last time, in a very specific way. He would need to take a self-portrait, but not just any self-portrait. This photograph would need to be imbued with his own life force, his own will, offered up as a lure, a sacrifice to draw the entity fully into the image, which would then act as a transitional prison. The photograph of the entity Arthur had just taken would serve as a catalyst, a pattern to guide the binding. The components for the ritual were esoteric and unsettling. Salt gathered from a place of sorrow, water from a source that flowed beneath the earth, silver dust. A mirror that had reflected a violent death, a detail Thorne chillingly glossed over, merely stating he could procure such an item for Arthur for a price. And herbs known for their properties of banishment and binding. Arthur felt a chill at the list. Each item seemed steeped in darkness and misfortune. He spent the next 2 days gathering what he could, his terror now mingled with a desperate, almost feverish resolve. Croft's blood money, which he had initially despised, now became the means to acquire these grim ingredients. Thorne's assistant arranged for the discreet delivery of the mirror, a small, antique silver hand mirror with a tarnished, ornate frame and a disturbingly cold feel to its glass. The apartment was a wreck, the aftermath of the entity's fury. Broken objects lay scattered. The air still held a residual chill, and the oppressive sense of malevolent presence was stronger than ever. The camera sat on its tripod, seemingly quiescent now, but Arthur knew it was merely biding its time, aware of his intentions. Perhaps even anticipating the coming confrontation. He felt its cold, knowing gaze on him as he prepared the ritual space in the center of his living room, following Thorne's precise instructions. He created a circle of salt, placing candles at the 4 cardinal points. In the center, he placed a small table, upon which he laid out the components: the bowl of subterranean water, the silver dust, the herbs, the photograph of the swirling, chaotic entity, and the cold, antique mirror. The cursed camera was positioned just outside the circle, aimed at a chair he would sit in, within the salt boundary. The final, terrible component was himself. He was to be both priest and sacrifice, conductor and bait. As night fell, a deep, unnatural stillness descended upon the city. Or perhaps it was just the bubble of intensified reality around Arthur's apartment. He changed into clean, simple clothes, as Thorn had instructed, and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He clutched the obsidian, its coolness a small comfort. He knew that failure meant not just death, but a fate far worse, eternal torment. His soul consumed and enslaved by the entity. He stepped into the salt circle, the grainy crystals crunching under his feet. He sat in the chair, facing the camera's impassive lens. The photograph of the entity lay before him on the table, its chaotic energy seeming to pulse faintly in the candlelight. He picked up the antique mirror, its coldness seeping into his hand. He had to look into it, to see his own reflection, while simultaneously inviting the entity to possess that reflection, to be drawn into the self-portrait he was about to take. It was a horrifying prospect, a deliberate invitation to madness. He began the incantation Thorn had taught him, his voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as he focused his will. His intent. The words were ancient, alien, grating on his tongue, but he felt a strange power begin to build in the room, a resonance between himself, the camera, and the unseen forces he was trying to command. The air grew thick, the candles flickered violently, and the familiar, bone-chilling cold returned, more intense than ever. He could feel the entity stirring, its attention focusing on him, on the ritual. It was a battle of wills, a desperate gamble played out between light and shadow, with his soul as the ultimate stake. Chapter 9. Flashpoint of Souls. The incantation vibrated in the frigid air, each syllable a spark against the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. Arthur felt the entity's focus narrow, an immense, unseen pressure building around the salt circle. It was like being at the bottom of a deep ocean, the weight of unseen fathoms crushing him. He held the cold, antique mirror in a trembling hand, his gaze fixed on his own reflection. His face, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, almost feral resolve. He could see the chaotic photograph of the entity reflected just behind his own image in the mirror's depths, a horrifying superimposition. The ritual demanded he invite the entity into this reflection, to merge with his likeness, so that the camera, his cursed companion, could capture them both, binding them together in a final, terrible union. He continued to chant, his voice growing stronger, imbued with what he didn't know he possessed. The words were a conduit, a bridge between his world and the abyssal realm the entity inhabited. Suddenly, the camera, positioned just outside the salt circle, clicked. Not the soft thwump hiss of the pneumatic shutter he controlled, but a sharper, more decisive mechanical click, as if it had acted on its own accord. The flash, if it had one, didn't fire. It was an old camera, reliant on ambient light or external flash powder, neither of which he'd prepared for this self-portrait. Yet a blinding, sickly green light erupted from the lens, bathing the room in its nauseating glow for a single, terrifying instant. It wasn't a photographer's flash. It was an unnatural, spectral luminescence, cold and searing. In that moment of green incandescence, Arthur saw it, reflected in the antique mirror, superimposed over his own horrified face, was the entity. No longer just a swirling chaos. It had taken on a more defined, yet utterly monstrous, form. It was a composite horror, a nightmarish amalgamation of the specters he'd seen in the photographs. The elongated skull from Eliza's portrait the needle-like fingers and hunched form from black woods, the falling, contorted limbs from marks. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were burning pits of malevolent green light, identical to the flash that had just erupted from the camera. It was looking directly at him, through him, its expression one of ravenous hunger and ancient, unimaginable hatred. The self-portrait, the one he was supposed to orchestrate, had been taken, but not by him. The entity, or the camera itself, had seized control of the moment, triggering the exposure. The glass plate in the camera now held not just his image, but his image intertwined with the raw, manifest form of the Specter. The green light vanished, plunging the room back into the flickering candlelight, but the monstrous afterimage burned behind Arthur's retinas. The psychic assault intensified tenfold. The howls and shrieks became deafening, clawing at his sanity. The salt's circle, his only protection, began to smoke and sizzle as if splashed with acid, the boundary weakening under the entity's furious onslaught. He could feel its tendrils reaching for him, cold, spectral fingers brushing against his skin, trying to breach the failing barrier. The antique mirror in his hand grew impossibly cold, then searingly hot, the rapid temperature shifts threatening to crack the glass. He dropped it with a cry, the mirror skittering across the floor. The ritual was spiraling out of control. He had intended to lure the entity into his image, but it felt as if it were trying to tear itself out of the camera, out of the freshly exposed plate, and possess him directly, using his own ritual as a gateway. He was losing. The entity's will was too strong, its rage too immense. He could feel his own consciousness flickering, overwhelmed by the sheer force of its malice. He was on the verge of blacking out, of surrendering his body and soul to the invading horror. Then, he remembered Dr. Thorne's final, desperate piece of advice, a last resort if the entity proved too powerful. The sacrifice must be absolute. If you cannot bind it, you must offer it something it cannot refuse, something that will satiate it or trap it through its own greed. Your life force, Mr. Finch, all of it. It was a suicide mission, a final, desperate gamble. With the last vestiges of his strength, Arthur lurched forward towards the table where the photograph of the swirling entity lay. He snatched it up, along with the bowl of subterranean water and the pouch of silver dust. His actions were no longer guided by the precise steps of the ritual, but by a raw, instinctual desperation. He had to sever the connection, to appease the monster, even if it meant his own destruction. He cried out, not in terror now, but in a defiant roar, a primal scream of resistance. Take it all. He plunged the photograph of the entity into the bowl of water, then scattered the silver dust over it, the metallic particles shimmering in the candlelight like captured stars. As the silver touched the wet print, an ear-splitting shriek ripped through the room, a sound of pure agony and rage, not from Arthur, but from the entity. The psychic pressure suddenly, impossibly, intensified, then just as suddenly it began to recede. The light from the candles flared wildly, then steadied. The bone-chilling cold lessened, replaced by a clammy, residual chill. The howls and shrieks diminished, fading into whimpers, then into an echoing silence. Arthur, gasping, fell to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked at the bowl. The photograph of the entity was dissolving, the chaotic image swirling and breaking apart, the silver dust reacting with the water and the emulsion, creating a murky, bubbling concoction. It was as if the entity's essence, captured in that first horrifying photograph, was being neutralized, consumed by the combined elements. He then looked towards the camera. The plate holder, containing the self-portrait, the image of him intertwined with the monstrous form, was still in place. He knew, with a certainty that transcended rational thought, that the entity, or a significant portion of its power, was now trapped within that plate, drawn in by his offered life force, his willingness to sacrifice himself. But the sacrifice had been incomplete. He was still alive, albeit drained, shattered. Had he truly bound it? Or had he merely wounded it, driven it deeper into the cursed image where it now resided. Linked inextricably to his own likeness, the immediate aftermath was one of profound, unnerving stillness. The salt circle was broken in several places, the candles guttered low. The apartment was a wreck, but the oppressive, malevolent presence had lifted, replaced by an echoing emptiness, a void where the entity's rage had been. Arthur felt utterly depleted, physically and spiritually scarred. He picked up the plate holder from the camera, his hand still shaking. He didn't dare develop it immediately. He didn't know what he would see, what new horror awaited him. The ritual had concluded, but the outcome was terrifyingly ambiguous. Was the curse broken, or had he merely transformed its nature, binding the specter not to the camera itself, but to his own doomed image, his own fading soul? The flashpoint had passed, but the true cost, the ultimate price of his confrontation, was yet to be revealed. He was alive, but he was a changed man, irrevocably marked by his descent into the abyss. Chapter 10. The Price of Stillness. The silence that descended upon Arthur's apartment in the aftermath of the ritual was more unnerving than the preceding chaos. It was a dead silence, heavy and absolute, as if the very air held its breath, waiting. He sat on the floor amidst the debris, the broken salt circle, the scattered herbs, the overturned candles, for what felt like hours, his body trembling with exhaustion and residual terror. The spectral fury had ceased, the oppressive presence lifted, but in its place was a hollow, echoing void that seemed to suck all warmth, all life from the room. He felt like a battlefield, scarred and ravaged, the victor and the vanquished indistinguishable in the smoldering ruins. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? The image of the monstrous entity superimposed over his own reflection in the antique mirror, its burning green eyes, was seared into his memory. And the undeveloped plate, the self-portrait taken in that blast of spectral light, lay heavy in his hands, a Pandora's box he was terrified to open. Eventually, driven by a mixture of dread and a desperate need for answers, he stumbled into his darkroom. The familiar red glow of the safe light felt alien, intrusive after the profound darkness of the ritual. His hands still shook as he prepared the chemicals, his movements clumsy, almost robotic. He slid the exposed glass plate, his self-portrait with the entity, into the developer. This time, there was no eager anticipation, no artistic curiosity, only a cold, clinical dread. He watched, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, as the image slowly began to materialize. It was him, yes, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a terror that was all too real. But intertwined with his features, woven into the very fabric of his likeness, was the monstrous form he had seen in the mirror. Its skeletal, shadowy limbs seemed to embrace him, its needle-like fingers merging with his hair, its burning green eyes looking out from within his own. It wasn't just a superimposition. It was a horrifying fusion, a depiction of a soul possessed, a man consumed. The entity was there, undeniably, trapped within the emulsion, bound to his image. But it was not a passive prisoner. It looked triumphant. Its presence in the photograph was not one of defeat, but of insidious integration. Arthur stared at the developed plate, a low moan escaping his lips. This was not the victory he had hoped for. He had not banished the entity. He had merely absorbed it. Or rather, it had absorbed a part of him. He completed the development process numbly, fixing the image, making this horrifying union permanent. He couldn't bring himself to make a print. The negative itself was too terrible to behold for long. He wrapped the glass plate in thick black cloth and hid it at the bottom of a locked trunk, a secret shame, a testament to his terrifying, ambiguous ordeal. He then turned his attention to the camera. It sat on its tripod, impassive, its lens dark and unreadable. He cautiously touched it, expecting to feel that familiar cold thrum of malevolent energy. But there was nothing, or almost nothing. The intense, predatory hunger that had radiated from it before was gone. It felt quiet, dormant, like a weapon disarmed or a beast sated. The silence from the camera was profound, a stark contrast to its previous, demanding presence. Was this it? Was the curse finally broken, or at least transferred and contained within that single, horrifying self-portrait? In the days that followed, a fragile, uneasy peace settled over Arthur. The whispers in his mind had ceased. The oppressive atmosphere in his apartment lifted. He cleaned up the wreckage from the ritual, tried to restore some semblance of normalcy, though he knew normalcy was a shore he might never reach again. He even ventured outside, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, the city sounds no longer seeming to accuse him, but merely to exist, indifferent to his private horrors. He felt hollowed out, as if a vital part of him had been scooped away, but also strangely lighter, unburdened from the constant psychic assault. He tried to tell himself he had succeeded, that he had faced the abyss and survived. He had paid a terrible price. Yes, his soul now inextricably linked to that monstrous image locked away in the trunk. But the camera itself seemed neutralized. He didn't dare touch it, didn't even look at it for long, but its silence was a profound relief. He attempted to return to some semblance of his former life. He contacted his few remaining clients, trying to pick up the threads of his freelance work. He even forced himself to use his digital camera, the familiar feel of it a small comfort. A reminder of a time before the antique horror had entered his life. But the joy was gone. Photography, once his passion, now felt like a chore, each click of the shutter a faint, unsettling echo of the cursed camera's deadly sigh. The images he produced were technically proficient, but lifeless, lacking the depth, the spark he had once been known for. It was as if the entity, in being bound to his image, had taken his artistic soul with it. He was a changed man, haunted by what he had seen, what he had done. The trauma of his ordeal cast a long, dark shadow over everything. He found himself easily startled, prone to bouts of anxiety, his sleep still troubled by fragmented nightmares. The world seemed muted, its colors less vibrant. It sounds less joyful. He was a ghost in his own life, going through the motions, the price of the stillness he had bought with his desperate ritual. He had silenced the monster, but in doing so, he had silenced a part of himself. The price of stillness was a piece of his soul, now forever trapped in silver halide with a specter from the void. Chapter 11. A Fading Image. Weeks turned into months. The silence from the cursed camera remained absolute. Arthur slowly, painstakingly, began to rebuild a fragile facade of normalcy. He paid his overdue bills with the last of Croft's blood money, the act leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He took on small, uninspiring photography jobs, product shots, bland corporate headshots, anything to keep the wolf from the door, anything that didn't require him to delve too deeply into the human soul. He avoided people, his social interactions dwindling to the bare minimum. The memory of Eliza's fate, of Mark's shattered leg, of Silas Blackwood's terror-stricken end, was a constant, aching presence. He was a pariah in his own mind, a man who had trafficked with darkness and emerged irrevocably tainted. The obsidian stone Dr. Thorne had given and became a permanent fixture in his pocket, a small, cold comfort he clutched whenever the weight of his memories threatened to overwhelm him. He never contacted Thorne again. He didn't know what he would say. Had he won? Had he lost? The outcome was too ambiguous, too personal to share. Despite the surface calm, a deep-seated unease began to grow within him. The stillness he had achieved felt unnatural. The entity had been too powerful, too ancient, to be so easily quelled, even by a ritual as desperate and sacrificial as the one he had performed. Lingering doubts about the ritual's true success began to plague his waking thoughts and seep into his already troubled dreams. He started experiencing unsettling synchronicities. He'd glimpse faces in crowds that momentarily resembled the monstrous form from his self-portrait. Shadows in his apartment would sometimes seem to writhe with a familiar, unsettling energy, only to resolve into ordinary shapes when he looked directly at them. A familiar cold dread the precursor to the entity's active presence, would occasionally creep back into his life. A fleeting chill on a warm day, a sudden, inexplicable wave of despair. These moments were brief, transient, easily dismissed as lingering trauma or an overactive imagination. But they were happening with increasing frequency, each one a tiny crack in the fragile edifice of his recovery. The cursed camera remained dormant, a silent, brooding presence on his workbench. He'd tried moving it, thinking of storing it away, but an inexplicable reluctance, almost a superstitious fear, prevented him. It was as if, despite everything, a part of him still felt bound to it, responsible for it. Or perhaps, he feared that disturbing it might reawaken whatever sliver of its consciousness remained. But it was the other artifact, the developed glass plate hidden in the locked trunk, that began to exert a more insidious pull. His self-portrait with the entity. He had vowed never to look at it again, to keep that horrifying fusion of his likeness and the monster's form buried, forgotten. Yet he found himself thinking about it more and more, a morbid curiosity mingling with his dread. What if it had changed? What if the entity, trapped within the emulsion, was somehow evolving? The thought was terrifying, yet irresistible. One rain-swept evening, the city outside a mournful symphony of distant sirens and drumming water, Arthur found himself standing before the locked trunk. The key felt cold in his trembling hand. He knew he shouldn't do it, that some doors are best left unopened. But the compulsion was too strong, a dark magnet pulling him towards the horrifying secret within. He unlocked the trunk, the creak of its hinges loud in the oppressive silence of his apartment. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the thick black cloth that enshrouded the plate. He hesitated, his heart pounding. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he drew it out. He carried it to his small desk, his hands shaking so much he nearly dropped it. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, deliberately, as if unveiling a relic of unimaginable horror. And there it was, his face, his terror, and a monstrous entity intertwined, a permanent record of his damnation. At first glance, it seemed unchanged. The same horrifying fusion, the same silent scream in his eyes, the same triumphant malevolence in the Specter's spectral features. Relief, faint and fragile, washed over him. Perhaps his fears were unfounded. Perhaps the ritual had truly contained it, frozen it in that single, terrible moment. But then, he looked closer, his photographer's eye, honed by years of scrutinizing minute details, taking over. And he saw it. A change. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. The monstrous aspect within the photograph, the shadowy limbs, the needle-like fingers, the burning green eyes, they seemed sharper, more defined, more prominent than he remembered. Conversely, his own likeness, his human features, seemed slightly fainter, more translucent, as if he were slowly being consumed, his image fading as the entities grew stronger, clearer. It was as if the entity, imprisoned within the photograph, was feeding on his captured essence, drawing sustenance from his very likeness, slowly, patiently, erasing him from their shared, cursed canvas. A strangled cry escaped Arthur's lips. He stumbled back from the desk, his eyes wide with a fresh, dawning horror. The ritual hadn't just bound the entity to his image. It had created a parasitic relationship. The entity was not banished, not neutralized, but had instead merged with him in a way far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. It was tethered to his photograph, yes, but it was also consuming it, consuming him from within the confines of that glass plate. The stillness he had experienced was not peace. It was the quiet digestion of his soul. The unsettling synchronicities, the returning cold dread, they were not just lingering trauma. They were the stirrings of the entity as it grew stronger, as his own life force, his own identity, was siphoned away into that horrifying, two-dimensional prison. The price of stillness was not just a piece of his soul. It was the entirety of it, being slowly, methodically devoured. His fading image on the glass plate was a chilling prophecy of his own impending erasure. Chapter 12. The darkroom beckons anew. The horrifying realization that his own image, his very essence, was being consumed by the entity within the self-portrait sent Arthur spiraling into a new abyss of terror. The photograph was no longer just a static record of a past horror. It was an active, ongoing process of his own annihilation. He was being devoured from within. His life forced a slow feast for the imprisoned Specter. The stillness he had cherished was the quiet of a parasite feeding on its host. He rewrapped the glass plate in its black shroud and locked it back in the trunk. But the knowledge of what it contained, what it was doing to him, was a cancer in his mind. He felt a profound, debilitating weakness, not just physical but spiritual, as if his very being were becoming unraveled, thread by thread. The world around him seemed to lose its substance, its colors fading, its sounds becoming distant and muffled, mirroring the slow erasure of his likeness in the cursed photograph. The old compulsion, the urge to use the camera, began to return, but this time it was different, perversely twisted. It wasn't the artistic desire for clarity or the desperate need to understand its mechanics that had driven him before. This was a raw, primal hunger, a desperate craving that seemed to emanate from the very core of his depleted being. He understood, with a chilling certainty, that this urge was not entirely his own. It was the entity growing stronger, now able to exert its influence more directly, projecting its hunger into him. It needed sustenance, and its current meal, his captured image, was perhaps too slow, too unsatisfying. It wanted fresh prey, and it wanted him to be the hunter. He fought it with what little strength he had left. He clutched the obsidian, repeated the warding chants Dr. Thorn had taught him, but they felt like flimsy shields against a raging inferno. The entity was inside him now, in a way, intertwined with his fading image, its desires becoming his desires. The cursed camera, which he had left dormant on his workbench, seemed to reawaken. He hadn't touched it since the ritual, hadn't dared. But now it seemed to call to him, its dark lens like a cold, knowing eye, its polished wood and brass gleaming with a renewed, expectant malevolence. He would find himself standing before it, his hand outstretched, drawn by an irresistible force. Sometimes he would black out for moments, only to find himself with his fingers tracing its contours, a strange, almost reverent expression on his face, an expression that wasn't his own. He was losing the battle for his own will. The camera was no longer just an external object. It was becoming an extension of the consuming void within him. He felt its pull not just as a mental suggestion, but as a physical imperative, a biological need as urgent and undeniable as the need for air or water. One evening, the compulsion became unbearable. He was pacing his apartment, his skin clammy, his thoughts a chaotic whirl, the hunger gnawing at him, a hollow ache in his soul. He tried to resist, tried to focus on Eliza's face, on Mark's suffering, on the horror he had already wrought. But the entity's influence was too strong, his own will too eroded. He found himself at the workbench, his hands moving with a horrifying, practiced familiarity, uncovering the camera, checking its mechanisms, selecting a fresh glass plate. He was moving like an automaton, his actions dictated by a will that was not his own. He knew, on some distant, horrified level of his consciousness, that he was succumbing, that he was about to cross a line from which there could be no return. But the driving hunger, the entity's hunger, was overwhelming. He left his apartment, the heavy camera in its bag, a cold, dead weight at his side. He didn't have a specific subject in mind. He simply walked, letting the camera, or the entity within him, guide his steps. The city streets, once familiar, now seemed like a hunting ground, filled with potential prey. Every face he passed, every fleeting glimpse of life, registered as a possible target. He found himself on the outskirts of a park, the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, the shadows deep and inviting. He saw a stray cat, a sleek black shadow, picking its way through the undergrowth. Before he could even consciously process the thought, he was setting up the camera, his movements swift and efficient, chillingly so. The cat, startled by his presence, froze, its eyes wide, luminous green pools in the darkness, eerily reminiscent of the entity's gaze. He focused, the image of the cat appearing on the ground glass. Stark and vulnerable, he squeezed the shutter bulb. Thwomp hiss. The sound, once a source of artistic thrill, then of terror, now carried a horrifying note of satisfaction. A tremor ran through him. A sickening jolt that was part revulsion, part a dark, vicarious pleasure. He rushed back to his apartment, the exposed plate clutched in his hand, the hunger momentarily abated, replaced by a cold, gnawing dread. He developed the plate in a frenzy, his darkroom illuminated by the hellish red glow. The image of the cat emerged, preternaturally sharp. Its eyes, so luminous in life, were now dull, lifeless in the photograph. And around its head, almost invisible in the deep shadows of the park, was a faint, ethereal collar, like a noose, woven from substance that looked like solidified shadow. Arthur stared at the image, his blood running cold. He knew what it meant. The next morning, he returned to the park, drawn by a morbid, inescapable compulsion. He found the cat not far from where he had photographed it. It was dead, its neck broken, a discarded length of thin, black wire lying nearby, almost invisible in the grass. It looked as if it had been strangled or had run into a makeshift snare. The ethereal noose in the photograph had found its physical counterpart. The horror of what he had done, what he had become, crashed down on him with renewed force. He had killed again, not for money this time, not under duress, but driven by the entity's hunger, a hunger that was now, terrifyingly, his own. The camera was not just a tool for a distant entity. It was a direct conduit for his own corrupted will. The cursed camera, which he thought was neutralized or whose curse was contained within his self-portrait, had not been. It had merely evolved its method of operation. The curse was not only active but had transformed, now inextricably linked to his own diminishing life force, his own fading image, the camera demanding a new, more direct form of sustenance, with him as its willing or unwillingly complicit hunter. He was no longer just Arthur Finch, photographer. He was becoming the Specter in the camera, a predator stalking the shadows, his art a harbinger of death, his soul a fading image in a gallery of horrors. Chapter 13. Shudder on Reality. The death of the stray cat, a direct consequence of his actions, marked a horrifying turning point for Arthur. The fragile barrier between his own will and the entity's hunger had shattered. He was no longer merely influenced. He was becoming an instrument, a willing, or at least unresisting, hand for the camera's malevolent purpose. The brief satisfaction he'd felt after taking the photograph, that sickening, vicarious thrill, now haunted him, a terrifying indicator of how deeply the corruption had taken root. His psychological and physical health, already precarious, began a rapid, terrifying decline. The hollowing out he had felt before intensified, as if his very substance were being leached away, leaving behind an empty, echoing shell. Sleep became a landscape of waking nightmares, populated by the ghostly visages of his victims. Eliza's sorrowful eyes, Mark's surprised face, Silas Blackwood's silent scream, and now, the wide, unblinking stare of the dead cat. They swirled around him in the darkness, silent accusers, their forms sometimes merging with a monstrous entity from his self-portrait, its burning green eyes always watching, always hungry. His waking hours were no better. He was plagued by chilling visions, fleeting glimpses of the spectral world that now seemed to bleed into his own. He'd see the shadowy, needle-like fingers of the entity reaching from dark corners, hear its sibilant whispers in the rustle of leaves or the creak of his apartment building. The distinct, ozonic scent of the camera clung to him, a permanent, nauseating perfume that isolated him further from the mundane world. He rarely left his apartment now, except when the hunger, The entity's hunger became too strong to bear. These excursions were furtive, shame-filled hunts, his eyes scanning the world for new subjects, new lives to feed the insatiable void within him and within the camera. He avoided people, focusing on stray animals, on birds in the park, on anything that possessed a spark of life, however small. Each photograph taken was another nail in the coffin of his soul, another small death that chipped away at his remaining humanity. The resulting images were always chillingly prophetic, the subtle, spectral harbingers of doom, an unseen snare, a predatory shadow, a glint of something sharp and deadly, always manifesting in the final print, always preceding a swift, corresponding end for the unfortunate subject. The camera itself seemed to exude a cold, triumphant power. Its polished wood gleamed, its brass fittings shone, as if it were thriving on the life force it consumed through Arthur's reluctant lens. He no longer tried to cover it or hide it away. It was his constant companion, his tormentor, his master. He found himself cleaning it obsessively, handling it with a strange mixture of reverence and revulsion, his actions dictated by a will that was no longer entirely his own. He was losing himself, his identity blurring, his memories becoming fragmented, overlaid with the camera's dark history, its insatiable hunger. He would look in the mirror and see not Arthur Finch, but a gaunt, haunted stranger with eyes that held a disturbing, predatory light, the same cold gleam he had once glimpsed in the camera's lens. The lines on his face seemed to deepen, to etch themselves into a permanent mask of sorrow and guilt. He was aging rapidly, his body reflecting the decay of his soul. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was no longer just the camera's operator. He was becoming its prime subject, a living conduit for the entity's will, a bridge between its shadowy realm and the world of the living. The self-portrait, locked away in the trunk, was the anchor, the point of fusion, but the camera was the instrument of its continued influence, its means of feeding and growing stronger. His life force was intertwined with the entity's, his fading image in that cursed photograph, a constant reminder of his own slow erasure. Perhaps, he thought in moments of bleak clarity, this was the camera's ultimate design, to consume its custodian not just physically, but spiritually, to hollow them out and wear their skin, to transform them into another specter in its long, horrifying lineage. He was becoming the ghost in the machine, his humanity a flickering candle in an encroaching, all-consuming darkness. The shutter of the camera was not just closing on his subjects' lives. It was closing on his own reality, trapping him in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. His art had become his damnation, his lens a window into hell, and he, the unwilling gatekeeper, slowly, inexorably, becoming one of its denizens. The line between photographer and photographed, between observer and observed, had dissolved, leaving only the hungry eye of the camera and the fading echo of the man who had once dared to look through it. Chapter 14. The Specter's Self-Portrait. The descent was no longer a slide. It was a plummet. Arthur Finch, the man, the artist, was a fading echo, a whisper in the storm of the entity's burgeoning power. The hunger was constant now, a gnawing void that demanded to be filled. His furtive hunts for small lives became less frequent, not because his will to resist had grown, but because his physical strength was failing. He was a wraith, his body emaciated, his movements slow and deliberate, as if wading through a viscous, unseen medium. The apartment, once his sanctuary, then his prison, was now a tomb, the air thick with the chill of the grave and the cloying, metallic scent of the camera's aura. He rarely spoke, his voice a dry, rasping whisper when he did, the words often not his own, but fragments of the entity's sibilant urgings. He was a vessel, a conduit, his humanity almost entirely subsumed. Yet, within the dying embers of his consciousness, a new, perverse obsession began to take root. It was not a flicker of his old self, but a twisted reflection of it, a final, Desperate gambit initiated not by Arthur, but by the dominant, consuming entity that now wore his form. If he, or rather it, could fully understand its own nature through the camera's lens, if it could capture its true, unadulterated essence without the intermediary of a resisting human soul, perhaps it could achieve a new form of apotheosis, a permanent, unassailable existence, no longer reliant on a fading human host or the slow siphoning of life from fleeting subjects. It was a desire for a definitive self-portrait, not of Arthur Finch, but of the Specter itself, in its full, unveiled glory. This was not a plan for salvation, but for a more complete and terrible damnation, a final surrender to the void. The preparations for this ultimate act were slow, ritualistic, performed by hands that moved with an eerie, unnatural grace. Arthur, or the thing that was Arthur, gathered the remnants of his photographic materials, his movements guided by an intelligence that was ancient and infinitely patient. He set up the camera not in the center of the room, as he had for his own disastrous self-portrait, but in the darkest corner, the place where the entity's presence had always felt strongest, where the veil between worlds seemed thinnest. He didn't aim it at a chair or at any specific object. He aimed it at the empty air, at the oppressive blackness that seemed to pulse with a hidden, unseen life. This was to be a photograph of the void itself, or rather, of the consciousness that resided within it. Or perhaps it was to be a photograph of himself, in his final, terrifying surrender, his body a mere vessel for the Specter's triumphant emergence. The distinction no longer mattered. He was the camera, and the camera was him, and both were instruments of the abyss. He loaded a single glass plate, his hand steady, his eyes holding that cold, predatory gleam that was no longer a fleeting reflection, but his permanent state. There was no incantation this time, no salt circle, no protective wards. Such measures were irrelevant now. This was not a confrontation, but a consummation. He stood before the camera, not as its operator, but as its subject, its offering. He looked directly into the lens, into its dark, unblinking eye, and he saw not his own reflection, but the swirling, chaotic vortex of the entity's true form, the image he had captured once before, the image that was now devouring his soul from within the locked trunk. But this time, there was no terror, no resistance. There was only a profound, chilling acceptance, a merging of wills, or rather, the complete subjugation of one by the other. He reached out, his long, skeletal fingers caressing the cool wood of the camera, then moving to the pneumatic shutter bulb. He paused, a single, shuddering breath escaping his lips, a final, human exhalation before the ultimate transformation. Then he squeezed the bulb. Thwump hiss. The camera's sigh was different this time. Not the sound of the machine, but of something organic, something sated, something complete. No spectral green light erupted. No violent winds tore through the room. There was only a profound, bone-deep silence, a stillness that was the epitome of absolute death or absolute union. Arthur remained standing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the lens. Then he slowly, deliberately, removed the exposed plate holder. He carried it into the darkroom, his movements fluid, almost graceful, a horrifying parody of his former artistic self. He developed the plate with meticulous care, his eyes, burning with an unnatural light in the crimson glow of the safe light, fixed on the emerging image. It was a masterpiece of horror. It was not a photograph of an empty corner, nor was it merely a portrait of Arthur Finch in his final, wasted state. It was something far more terrifying. The image was a window into an otherworldly abyss, a swirling vortex of impossible geometries and tormented, shadowy forms, more vivid, more terrifyingly detailed than the previous photograph of the entity. And at its heart, where before there had been only a core of absolute blackness, there was now a face. Arthur's face, or what had once been Arthur's face. His features were elongated, distorted, his eyes vast, empty pits reflecting the surrounding chaos, his mouth a rictus of silent, eternal agony. But there was also a terrifying serenity to it, a look of profound, ultimate belonging. He was one with the void, absorbed into its fabric, his individuality erased, his essence woven into the tapestry of the abyss. The creation of this final, horrifying photograph was the entity's ultimate triumph. It had not just captured a soul, it had consumed it, integrated it, made it a part of its own monstrous, eternal self. The last vestiges of Arthur Finch's humanity, his consciousness, his very identity, were irrevocably lost, poured into that silver halide nightmare. What remained was an empty vessel, a shell animated by the ancient, malevolent intelligence of the camera, a specter in human form, its purpose fulfilled, its hunger, for now, sated. The camera, its lens like a dark star, had taken its ultimate self-portrait, and Arthur Finch was its eternal, silent, screaming centerpiece. The shutter had finally, definitively, closed on his reality. Chapter 15, Posthumous Prince. The shell that had once been Arthur Finch continued to exist, for a time, in the silent, tomb-like apartment. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, its actions dictated by the ancient intelligence that now fully inhabited it. It carefully packed away the photographic equipment, not just the cursed camera, but all of Arthur's old gear, his lights, his lenses, his darkroom supplies. Each item was cleaned, wrapped, and stored with a chilling, meticulous precision, as if preparing for a long journey, or perhaps a long dormancy. The final, horrifying self-portrait, the glass plate depicting Arthur's face subsumed into the abyssal vortex, was not hidden away. Instead, it was placed on the workbench, propped up carefully, facing the cursed camera like an offering or a mirror reflecting its true, triumphant nature. Then, one gray, featureless morning, the shell of Arthur Finch walked out of the apartment, carrying nothing, and vanished without a trace. No note was left, no explanation. He simply ceased to be, another name added to the camera's long, dark ledger of consumed souls. Years passed. The apartment, after a period of official inquiry and procedural red tape, was eventually cleared out, its contents sold off or discarded. The new tenants knew nothing of its previous occupant, or the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The cursed camera, along with its accoutrements and the chilling glass plate self-portrait, found its way into a dusty auction house specializing in unusual antiques and curiosities. It sat there for a while, overlooked, its dark wood and tarnished brass failing to attract much attention amidst more ostentatious items. But its inherent malevolence, its silent call, was patient. Eventually, inevitably, it caught the eye of a young, ambitious photographer, a woman named Sarah, who, much like Arthur before her, was drawn to its antique charm, its evident craftsmanship, and the almost imperceptible thrum of energy that seemed to emanate from it. She purchased it for a modest sum, thrilled with her find, envisioning the unique, atmospheric portraits she would create. The glass plate self-portrait, with its disturbing, abstract imagery, was included in the lot, dismissed by the auctioneer as a damaged or experimental plate. But Sarah found it strangely compelling, hauntingly beautiful in its own dark way. She decided to keep it, perhaps as a source of avant-garde inspiration. She took the camera back to her bright, modern studio, a stark contrast to Arthur's shadowy den. She was excited to experiment with it, to master its anachronistic workings. Her first subject was her own beloved cat, a fluffy Persian named Snowball. She composed the shot with care, the image on the ground glass dim, but intriguing. She squeezed the pneumatic shutter bulb. Thwomp hiss. The familiar, soft sigh of the camera echoed in the studio, a sound that now carried the weight of forgotten tragedies and future sorrows. When Sarah developed the plate, she was astonished by the clarity, the almost supernatural detail. Snowball looked regal, almost ethereal. But as she examined the print more closely, she noticed a faint, almost subliminal detail in the deep shadows behind the cat. A pair of eyes, burning, green, and filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. And behind those eyes, barely discernible, was the ghostly, elongated outline of a human face, gaunt and sorrowful, its features contorted in a silent, eternal scream. It was Arthur Finch, his tormented visage now a permanent fixture in the camera's dark tapestry, a silent, spectral witness to the unfolding of its undying curse. Sarah, initially, dismissed it as a trick of the light, a flaw in the old plate, or perhaps an unintentional double exposure from a previous, unknown owner. But she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling the image evoked. The next day, Snowball, who had been perfectly healthy, was found dead, having suffered a sudden, inexplicable seizure, its eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the photographed expression. Sarah was devastated, confused. She looked again at the photograph, and the ghostly face in the background, Arthur's face, seemed clearer now, its sorrow more profound, its silent scream more audible to her soul. The cycle had begun anew. The cursed camera, with its new, integrated Specter, had claimed another victim. The horror would continue, pass from one unsuspecting hand to another, each new photograph a potential death sentence, each image potentially bearing the faint, sorrowful imprint of Arthur Finch. A prisoner in the emulsion, a posthumous print himself, forever bound to the Specter's eternal, malevolent gaze. The camera waited patiently for its next session, its lens a dark portal, reflecting not just the world before it, but the abyss within and the growing gallery of souls trapped in its timeless, horrifying embrace. And there it is, friends, the chilling tale of the Specter in the camera. What becomes of Sarah? Does she uncover the camera's horrifying legacy? Does she, too, fall prey to its insidious influence? Her own face eventually joining Arthur's in that spectral gallery? Perhaps those are stories for another dark night. For now, I hope this journey into the shadows has left you with a delightful shiver, a newfound apprehension for those forgotten objects that lurk in the corners of antique shops, and perhaps a closer look at your own photographs. What unseen details might they hold? Thank you for listening, for joining me here on the Eli Nightfall channel. If you enjoyed this descent into terror, please do leave a like, a comment sharing your thoughts or your own spooky experiences, and most importantly, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next venture into the macabre. Your support keeps these dark tales alive. Until next time, stay safe, keep the lights on if you must, and always be wary of what you capture and what might be capturing you. Sweet nightmares.